Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you're standing in a vast hall. The silence is absolute, but if you listen carefully, you can almost hear whispers, echoes of 1,000,000 conversations that never finished. Questions that were answered once, but will never be answered again. You're about to discover something that changes everything you thought you knew about human progress. About what we've lost. About who decides what you're allowed to remember. This isn't ancient history. This is happening now. And by the end of this journey, you'll never look at knowledge, at truth itself, the same way again. The story begins with fire. It always begins with fire. Picture yourself standing in the ruins of what was once the greatest library on earth. The walls that remain tell you nothing about what happened here. The silence is absolute. But if you close your eyes, you can almost sense it, the weight of what's missing. This wasn't just a building. It was a repository of everything humanity had ever learned, discovered, and understood. And in a single night, it turned to ash. The smoke from that fire rose into the sky over 2,000 years ago, carrying with it something far more valuable than the scrolls themselves. It carried answers, solutions to problems we're still trying to solve today, maps to places we've convinced ourselves never existed, medical knowledge describing surgeries we claim to have invented only in the last century, technologies we can't replicate even with our modern tools. All of it gone, erased. And what remains is barely a whisper of what once was. We're taught that history is a story of constant progress, that we're always moving forward, always getting smarter, always building on what came before. But that's not quite true, because the foundation we're building on is incomplete, fractured, full of gaps so vast that entire civilizations could fit inside them. And those gaps weren't carved out by time or accident. They were created deliberately. Here's what they don't tell you in school. Of all the texts written in the ancient world, less than 1% survive today. Think about that for a moment. Everything you've ever read about ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, Babylon, all of it comes from the tiny fraction of knowledge that managed to escape the flames. The other 99% is simply gone. And we know enough about what disappeared to understand that it would change everything we think we know about who we are and where we came from. The ancient writers left us clues. They referenced books we'll never read. They quoted from texts that no longer exist. They debated ideas found in scrolls that turned to ash before anyone thought to make another copy. We know there were star charts predating the astronomy we credit to later civilizations. We know there were philosophical works that challenged the very foundations of every religion that rose to power afterward. We know there were engineering manuals describing machines and structures that shouldn't have been possible with the tools they supposedly had. And we know something else. Something that changes the entire story. These libraries didn't just burn by accident. They didn't disappear because of neglect or the slow decay of time. They were targeted, systematically destroyed. And in every case, the destruction happened at a very specific moment in history, right when new powers were rising, new religions consolidating control, new empires rewriting the past to serve the present. This isn't about books. It's about power, about who gets to decide what's true and what's forgotten, about the deliberate erasure of alternative timelines, alternative possibilities, alternative ways of understanding reality itself. When you burn a library, you're not just destroying paper and ink, you're eliminating evidence that the world could have been different, that it was different, that the official story you're being told is built on the ashes of 1,000 other stories that threatened it. So here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. What if everything we think we know about human history is built on that surviving 1%? What if the 99% that burned contained knowledge so profound, so transformative, so dangerous to the powers that came after, that its destruction wasn't collateral damage, It was the entire point. What if we're living in the diminished echo of what humanity once knew? The fire consumed more than scrolls. It consumed possibilities, and someone made sure it did. There's a number that should terrify you. Less than 1%. That's how much of the ancient world's written knowledge still exists today. Less than 1%. And we're not talking about minor texts or forgotten footnotes. We're talking about the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years, the complete works of minds so brilliant that the fragments they left behind still shape our world. Think about Aristotle. You know the name, you've heard the quotes. Universities build entire philosophy departments around his ideas. But here's what they don't mention in those lectures. Aristotle wrote approximately 200 works. We have 31. We're building our understanding of logic, ethics, politics, and metaphysics on 15% of what he actually put to paper. The other 85% is gone, burned, lost, erased from existence. And nobody can tell you what was in those missing texts. Nobody knows what insights, what discoveries, what revolutionary ideas disappeared with them. This isn't unique to Aristotle. It's the pattern everywhere you look. The Library of Alexandria catalogued over 700,000 scrolls at its peak. Modern scholars estimate we have fragments, not complete works, but fragments from perhaps 1% of that collection. 1%. Everything else is simply gone. But here's where it gets strange. We know what we're missing. We can name it. Ancient writers left us ghost books, texts that appear in references, in debates, in citations, but the originals themselves no longer exist. A scholar in the 3rd century would quote extensively from a work, analyze its arguments, build upon its ideas. And now, that original work has vanished entirely. We're left reading one side of a conversation, piecing together what must have been said from the responses that survived. Sophocles wrote over 120 plays. We have 7. 7. The rest are gone, though ancient critics described them in enough detail that we know what we're missing. Entire masterpieces. Complete explorations of the human condition. Lost. Sappho, considered one of the greatest poets in human history, wrote 9 books of poetry. We have fragments, pieces, lines quoted by other writers who happened to survive when she didn't. From 9 complete books, we can barely reconstruct a handful of poems. The names alone should haunt you. Philosophers whose ideas supposedly shaped civilizations, we know they existed only because someone else mentioned them in passing. Scientists whose discoveries might have pushed human knowledge forward by centuries, completely lost except for a single reference in a text that happened to escape the flames. We're not just missing books. We're missing entire branches of human thought. Hero of Alexandria designed automated machines, steam-powered devices, and mechanisms that sound like science fiction for the ancient world. We have descriptions of some of his inventions in surviving texts, but the detailed technical manuals, the step-by-step instructions, those were in works that didn't make it. Somewhere in the ruins of ancient libraries were texts describing technologies we're told shouldn't have existed for another 1,000 years. Maps showing coastlines and continents that official history claims weren't discovered until the age of exploration. Medical texts detailing surgical procedures we credit to modern innovation. And here's the part that should keep you awake. What survived might not have been random. When you lose 99% of something and 1% remains, you have to ask yourself, was that 1% the best? Or was it the safest, the least dangerous, the most acceptable to whoever came after? The texts we have might be the ones that posed no threat, the ones that could be absorbed into new power structures without challenging them. Everything else, the revolutionary ideas, the alternative histories, The knowledge that would have rewritten everything turned to ash, and someone decided what burned and what didn't. You might be wondering why any of this matters. Ancient libraries burned thousands of years ago. The knowledge is gone. Why does it matter to you, right now, in the present day? Because the loss isn't ancient history. It's affecting you today in ways you probably haven't considered. Right now, archaeologists are uncovering structures that shouldn't exist. Buildings constructed with techniques we can't replicate, even with modern engineering. The Pantheon in Rome has a concrete dome that's held perfectly for 2,000 years. We've tried to recreate Roman concrete using contemporary methods and failed. Our concrete cracks, crumbles, fails within decades. Theirs has stood for millennia, and we're only beginning to understand why. The formula existed. The complete instructions were written down in engineering texts that were housed in libraries. And those libraries burned. Greek fire changed the course of warfare for centuries. A substance that burned on water, that couldn't be extinguished by conventional means, that terrified every navy that faced it. The Byzantine Empire guarded the formula so carefully that when the empire fell, the knowledge died with it. Despite all our modern chemistry, despite centuries of research, we still don't know exactly what it was or how they made it. The texts describing its composition were destroyed. Deliberately or not, the result is the same. We lost it. And these aren't isolated cases. We're taught that human progress is linear, that we're always moving forward, always getting smarter, always building on what came before. But what if that's not true? What if we've climbed to great heights of knowledge multiple times in human history, only to fall back down when the libraries burned? What if the Dark Ages weren't periods of barbarism, but periods of collective amnesia, civilizations forgetting what they once knew because the knowledge centers were destroyed? Ancient texts describe surgical procedures we credit to modern medicine. Astronomical observations that required tools we're told they didn't have. Architectural techniques that would solve problems we're facing today. Sustainable building, efficient water management, climate adaptation through design. The solutions existed, they were recorded, and they burned before we could learn from them. Think about what that means. Somewhere in the ashes of ancient libraries were answers to questions we're still asking. Technologies that could change how we build, how we heal, how we organize societies. Maps showing lands and routes that official history claims weren't known for another 1,000 years. Alternative timelines of human civilization that would completely rewrite our understanding of who came before us and what they achieved. The pattern becomes disturbing when you examine it closely. These libraries didn't burn randomly. They burned at very specific moments in history, during conquests, during religious transformations, during political upheavals when new powers were consolidating control. And each time, certain types of knowledge disappeared. Knowledge that challenged the new order. Knowledge that offered alternative ways of understanding the world. Knowledge that, if it had survived, might have prevented the new powers from claiming absolute authority over truth itself. What if the burning of libraries wasn't collateral damage of war and conquest? What if it was the primary objective? Destroy the knowledge, and you destroy the ability to imagine alternatives. You eliminate evidence that things could be different, that they were different, that the story you're being told is just one version among many that used to exist. We live in a world built on fragments, on the 1% that survived, and we're told this is all there ever was, that we know the full story of human history. But we don't. We know the story that survived, the story that was allowed to survive. Everything else turned to ash, taking with it possibilities we can barely imagine. The libraries burned, but the questions they could have answered, those are still with us. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a library. Strip away everything you think you know about it from school textbooks and Hollywood movies, and what you're left with is something far stranger and more sophisticated than a simple collection of scrolls. This was the world's first true research institute, the first place in human history where knowledge itself became the primary obsession, where collecting and preserving information was treated as the highest possible goal. And it existed over 2,000 years ago. Picture the scene. Alexandria, Egypt, around 300 BC. The Ptolemaic rulers, who controlled Egypt after Alexander the Great's empire fractured, had a vision that bordered on madness. They wanted every piece of written knowledge in the world, not the important texts, not the famous works, everything. Every scroll, every document, every scrap of writing that existed anywhere, and they had the resources and the ruthlessness to pursue that vision. Ships would dock in Alexandria's harbour, carrying goods from across the known world. Before those ships could unload their cargo, they were searched, not for contraband or weapons, for books. Any scroll found aboard was immediately confiscated and taken to the library. Scribes would make copies, and those copies would be returned to the ship's owners. The originals stayed in Alexandria. Always the originals. This wasn't polite book collecting. This was systematic knowledge acquisition on a scale never attempted before or since. The library employed hundreds of scribes whose entire job was to copy and catalogue texts. But it was far more than just a storage facility. The complex included lecture halls where scholars debated and taught, laboratories where experiments were conducted, an astronomical observatory for studying the stars, botanical gardens for cataloguing plant species, even a zoo where animals from distant lands were kept for study. At the center was the museum, literally the temple of the muses where scholars lived and worked, supported entirely by the state so they could dedicate their lives to research. And the collection itself? It wasn't just Greek texts, though those were certainly there. The library contained Babylonian astronomy, Egyptian medical knowledge accumulated over millennia, Indian mathematics, Persian philosophy, Hebrew religious texts, works from civilizations whose names we've completely forgotten. Translators worked constantly, rendering texts from every known language into Greek, preserving knowledge that would have died when those languages disappeared. The minds that worked there should tell you everything about what this place really was. Euclid developed the foundations of geometry there. His Elements is still studied today. Eratosthenes didn't just work at the library, he ran it, and while serving as head librarian he calculated the Earth's circumference with shocking accuracy, using nothing but shadows and geometry. His measurement was off by less than 2%. 2%, over 2,000 years ago. Then there was Aristarchus. You probably haven't heard of him, but you should have. Because Aristarchus proposed that the Earth orbits the Sunday, not in vague mythological terms, with mathematical proofs, with calculations. 1800 years before Copernicus, there was a scholar in Alexandria who understood heliocentrism and could demonstrate it mathematically. His complete works, the detailed proofs, the full model of the solar system, those were in the library, and they burned. This is what we're really talking about when we talk about the Library of Alexandria. Not just a building full of old books. We're talking about the combined intellectual power of Google, Wikipedia, MIT, and the Library of Congress, except it existed when most of the world didn't have written language at all. We're talking about a place where human knowledge was being actively expanded, where scholars from different civilizations were synthesizing their understanding into something entirely new. And here's what makes the loss so devastating. This wasn't just passive storage. This was active research. The library was producing new knowledge, new discoveries, new understandings of reality. It was pushing humanity forward at a pace that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years after it fell. So, we've established what it was, perhaps the most important institution in human history, which makes what happened next even more suspicious. Because the story of how it was destroyed, they've changed it multiple times. Here's what they tell you in history class. The Library of Alexandria burned down in an accident during Julius Caesar's campaign in Egypt. A tragic loss. Collateral damage of ancient warfare. Nothing more to the story than bad luck and the chaos of battle. Case closed. Except that's not what happened. Because the Library of Alexandria didn't burn down once. It burned 4 separate times over the course of 700 years. And each time, specific categories of knowledge disappeared. That's not bad luck, that's a pattern. The first fire came in 48 BC. Caesar's forces were trapped in Alexandria's harbour, outnumbered and surrounded. In the fighting, flames spread from burning ships to the docks and into the city. Official histories call it an accident of war. But here's what makes it interesting. The sections that burned first, the scrolls that were lost in that initial blaze, were heavily concentrated in astronomical and navigational texts. Maps, star charts, mathematical calculations describing the movement of celestial bodies. The kind of knowledge that gave civilizations power over ocean travel, over time itself, over understanding humanity's place in the cosmos. Maybe that was coincidence. Maybe in the chaos of battle, those particular scrolls just happened to be stored in the buildings closest to the fire. Or maybe Roman forces, consolidating power over a conquered people, recognized which knowledge was most dangerous to leave intact. The library was rebuilt. Partially. What remained of the collection was supplemented by new acquisitions, by texts transferred from other libraries, by the continued work of scholars who refused to let the project die. And for 2 centuries, it continued, diminished but functioning, until the next fire. In 270 AD, during the reign of Emperor Aurelian, civil war tore through Alexandria. More buildings burned, more scrolls turned to ash. Again, official history frames this as unfortunate collateral damage. But the timing is worth noting. This was precisely the period when early Christianity was beginning to challenge the philosophical foundations of the Roman world. And the texts that disappeared in this second burning, philosophical works, alternative cosmologies, scientific explanations of natural phenomena that didn't require divine intervention, ideas that competed with the emerging Christian worldview for explanatory power. Another coincidence? Perhaps. But the pattern continues. The third destruction came in 391 AD. By this point, Christianity wasn't just challenging the old order, it had become the old order. Emperor Theodosius issued a decree that should tell you everything you need to know about what came next. He ordered the destruction of all pagan temples throughout the empire. Not their conversion, not their repurposing, their destruction. What remained of the Library of Alexandria was housed in the Serapeum, a temple complex dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis. When the Christian mobs came, led by Bishop Theophilus, they weren't just attacking a building, they were attacking what that building represented. Alternative ways of understanding the divine, competing paths to truth. Knowledge that suggested reality might be more complex, more mysterious, more open to interpretation than a single religious doctrine could contain. The texts that burned this time, works that contradicted biblical chronology, historical records suggesting civilizations older than Scripture allowed for, philosophical systems that offered paths to understanding existence without requiring faith in the Christian God. All of it deliberately targeted, all of it systematically destroyed, And there's a fourth burning, though modern scholars debate whether it actually happened. In 642 AD, after the Islamic conquest of Egypt, Caliph Omar allegedly ordered the remaining texts burned with a reasoning so blunt it's almost admirable in its honesty. If the books agree with the Quran, they're unnecessary. If they disagree with the Quran, they're dangerous. Either way, burn them. Most historians now believe this story was fabricated later to blame Muslims for what Christians had already completed. But true or false, the story itself reveals something. It shows that everyone understood what library burning really meant. It wasn't about eliminating lies. It was about eliminating alternatives. 4 fires, 700 years, each one conveniently erasing specific types of knowledge that threatened whoever held power at that moment. Astronomical knowledge that gave civilizations independence from religious authority over calendars and time. Philosophical knowledge that offered competing explanations of reality. Historical knowledge that contradicted the official timeline. Scientific knowledge that suggested the universe operated by discoverable laws rather than divine whim. You can call that coincidence if you want. You can believe that the same library just kept having incredibly bad luck at precisely the moments when certain knowledge became politically or religiously inconvenient. Or you can recognize what this actually was. A systematic effort, carried out over centuries, to control what humanity was allowed to know. Because whoever controls the past controls the present, and whoever controls knowledge controls reality itself. Here's the cruelest irony of the entire story. We know what we lost. We have the catalogue. Not the complete catalogue, but enough of it to understand exactly what was in that library. Enough to know precisely what we're missing. It's like having a detailed menu from a restaurant that burned down centuries ago, describing in exquisite detail every dish you'll never taste. Except instead of meals, we're talking about knowledge that could have changed the entire trajectory of human civilization. Ancient scholars were meticulous. They created bibliographies. They wrote commentaries on texts. They referenced sources in their own works. And when the original texts burned, sometimes those references survived. So we're left in this strange purgatory where we can read ancient writers debating ideas found in books that no longer exist. We can see them quoting passages from scrolls that turn to ash. We can watch them build arguments on foundations that have completely vanished. The library had an official catalogue called the Pinakes, created by a scholar named Callimachus. The catalogue itself was 120 scrolls long. Think about that. They needed 120 scrolls just to list what was in the library. Most of the Pinakes is lost now, but fragments survived. And those fragments reference works that sound like they're from a completely different timeline of human achievement. There were texts on powered flight, not mythology about gods with wings, technical descriptions. Hero of Alexandria designed automated machines, steam-powered devices, mechanical systems that wouldn't be seen again for over 1,000 years. We have some of his surviving works, but references suggest there were many more texts in the library, describing machines and devices that historians dismiss as impossible for the ancient world. Except we have the catalogue entries. We know they existed. Aristarchus's complete heliocentric model was there. We know this because other scholars criticized it, debated it, referenced his mathematical proofs. He didn't just suggest the Earth might orbit the Sunday. He demonstrated it mathematically. He calculated distances. He created a working model of the solar system with the sun at its center, 1800 years before Copernicus supposedly discovered the same thing. The detailed treatise explaining all of this? It burned. We're left with fragments, with second-hand descriptions, with the knowledge that someone figured it out and then that knowledge was lost. The medical texts were extraordinary. The library collected surgical techniques from Egypt, pharmaceutical knowledge from India, anatomical research from Greek physicians. These traditions were synthesized, compared, expanded upon. References describe surgical procedures that wouldn't be attempted again until the modern era. Descriptions of herbal preparations, whose chemical properties we're only now beginning to understand. All of it documented in texts that no longer exist. Then there are the maps. Ancient geographers referenced charts and maps housed in Alexandria, showing lands that official history claims weren't discovered for another millennium. Coastlines that shouldn't have been known, trade routes to places that supposedly hadn't been reached. Were these fantasy? Maybe. But the scholars who saw them treated them as legitimate geographical knowledge, not mythology. And the alternative histories. This is where it gets really interesting. The catalogue referenced complete works that told completely different stories about human civilization. Manetho's full history of Egypt, written by an Egyptian priest, reportedly went back tens of thousands of years before the first pharaoh. We have fragments, enough to know the complete work existed, enough to know it described predecessor civilizations, divine kings, timelines that contradict everything we're taught about when Egyptian civilization began. Berossus's Babylonian history supposedly chronicled civilization, going back hundreds of thousands of years, describing antediluvian kings, pre-flood civilizations. Again, we have only fragments, but ancient historians treated this as serious historical work, not mythology. The complete text would tell us how the Babylonians understood their own origins, what their records actually said about human history before the flood that appears in so many ancient traditions. There were works on alchemy and the transformation of matter, not the medieval European version obsessed with turning lead to gold, but sophisticated philosophical and practical texts exploring the nature of physical reality. Arab scholars who later accessed some of these texts before they were lost described processes and concepts that European alchemists spent centuries trying to reconstruct from incomplete fragments. The catalogue even lists titles we can barely comprehend. On the Nature of Time, Mathematical Proofs of Multiple Heavens, The True History of Egypt, Before the Pharaohs. These weren't fiction, they were scholarly works, catalogued and preserved alongside everything else. We have the treasure map. We know where the treasure was buried. We know exactly what was in it. And we know it's gone forever, destroyed so completely that only the description remains. That's not just loss, that's calculated erasure. And knowing exactly what we're missing makes it so much worse. Alexandria wasn't alone. That's the part they don't emphasize when they tell the story. There was another library, another center of knowledge, another place where humanity gathered everything it knew and tried to push further. The Library of Pergamum. And what happened to it should make you question everything about coincidence. Pergamum was in what's now Turkey, a rival power to Ptolemaic Egypt, and the Ptolemies understood exactly what that rivalry meant. This wasn't just political competition, it was a race for knowledge itself. Both libraries wanted the same thing, every text in existence, every scroll, every fragment of human understanding. They competed for rare manuscripts the way nations compete for resources today, because they understood something we've forgotten. Whoever controls knowledge controls the future. The rivalry got so intense that Ptolemy of Egypt banned papyrus exports to Pergamum. Think about that strategic move. Papyrus was the writing material of the ancient world, and Egypt controlled its production. By cutting off the supply, Ptolemy thought he could strangle Pergamum's library, slow its growth, maintain Alexandria's dominance. It was information warfare at its most basic level. But Pergamum didn't surrender. They innovated. They invented parchment-treated animal skin that was more durable than papyrus, more expensive to produce, but able to last for centuries. The word parchment itself comes from Pergamum, They created a superior technology out of necessity, and their library continued to grow. Over 200,000 scrolls at its peak. Different knowledge than Alexandria, but equally valuable. Pergamum specialized in what we might call practical sciences: medicine, biology, anatomy. The library was attached to a medical school where physicians conducted research that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. They performed dissections. They documented surgical procedures. They collected medical knowledge from across the known world: Greek medicine, Egyptian techniques, and texts that had traveled the trade routes from India and possibly even China. The library's most famous physician was Galen. You might know the name from medical history. His works on anatomy and medicine dominated Western medical knowledge for 1,500 years. 15 centuries of doctors learning from Galen's texts. But here's what they don't tell you. Galen's writings were summaries, compilations. He was synthesizing and condensing the knowledge contained in the library's vast medical collection. The original texts, the detailed surgical manuals, the pharmaceutical preparations, the anatomical research conducted over centuries, those were the real treasure. Galen's works were the cliff notes, and then something very convenient happened. Mark Antony, in his famous romance with Cleopatra, gave her a gift. The entire library of Pergamum, all 200,000 scrolls, packed up and shipped to Alexandria as a grand romantic gesture. The official story frames this as generosity, as a consolidation of knowledge in one great center of learning. But think about the logistics. Think about what this actually accomplished. 2 rival libraries, 2 separate repositories of human knowledge, suddenly in one location, all the eggs in one basket. And then, in the fires that followed, both collections burned together. Pergamum's unique medical knowledge, Alexandria's philosophical and astronomical texts, all turned to ash in the same flames. Convenient, isn't it? If you wanted to destroy humanity's collected knowledge, wouldn't it be easier to gather it all in one place first? Rather than burning multiple libraries across different regions, consolidate everything and then light the match. Whether this was intentional or not, the effect was the same. 2 streams of knowledge merged and then evaporated. Galen's works survived the fires, but only because they were useful to the powers that came after. Practical medical knowledge that didn't challenge religious doctrine, that could be absorbed into the medieval worldview without threatening it. The original texts he learned from, the detailed research, the advanced techniques, the knowledge that went beyond what he chose to record in his summaries, all lost. We're left reading the condensed version, the sanitized compilation, the knowledge that was deemed safe to preserve. Everything else, the dangerous insights, the revolutionary techniques, the medical understanding that might have accelerated human health by centuries, burned in Alexandria alongside Pergamum's relocated collection. 2 libraries, 1 fire, and the knowledge that made them rivals, the specialized understanding each had cultivated, gone forever, leaving us to build on fragments and wondering what we lost. While Europe was burning books and calling it piety, something remarkable was happening in Baghdad. The year was 830 AD, and the Abbasid Caliphate had just established what would become one of history's greatest centers of learning. They called it Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, and for 200 years, while the Christian world was destroying knowledge that contradicted Scripture, the Islamic world was collecting it, translating it, and building upon it. This wasn't just a library. It was a translation institute, a research center, an observatory, and a gathering place for the greatest minds of the age. Scholars came from everywhere: Greece, Persia, India, China, North Africa. They brought texts in languages most people had never heard of, and teams of translators worked to render all of it into Arabic. Not just preserving the knowledge, but creating a synthesis that hadn't existed before. Ideas from different civilizations colliding, combining, producing entirely new understanding. The irony should strike you as profound. Many of the Greek philosophical and scientific texts we have today don't survive in their original Greek. The European copies were destroyed in the various purges and fires that swept through the Christian world during the early medieval period. The only reason we have them at all is because scholars in Baghdad translated them into Arabic. Centuries later, when Europe finally decided it wanted that knowledge back, they had to translate it from Arabic into Latin. The Greeks wrote it, the Christians burned it, the Muslims saved it, and then the Christians translated it back and took credit for rediscovering it. The House of Wisdom expanded human knowledge in ways that wouldn't be matched for centuries. The word algebra comes from Arabic from the title of a book written by a scholar named Al-Khwarizmi, who worked at the House of Wisdom. Advances in astronomy that corrected Greek errors. Medical texts that synthesized techniques from half a dozen different traditions. Works on optics and engineering and mathematics that pushed far beyond what any single civilization had achieved alone. The library grew for 200 years. Imagine the accumulation: Greek philosophy, Persian astronomical observations, spanning centuries of meticulous record-keeping. Indian mathematical texts containing concepts Europe wouldn't understand for another 500 years. Chinese medical knowledge that had crossed the Silk Road, and the original works produced by Islamic scholars who had access to all of this syntheses and innovations building on the collected wisdom of the world. Then, in 1258, the Mongols came. The siege of Baghdad lasted 2 weeks. When the city fell, what followed was systematic destruction on a scale that still haunts historians. The Mongols threw the library's contents into the Tigris River. Not some of it, all of it. Hundreds of thousands of texts. The accounts from witnesses describe something almost incomprehensible. So many scrolls and books were thrown into the river that soldiers could walk across it. The books formed a bridge made of human knowledge, spanning the water, and then dissolving as the pages absorbed the current and sank. The river ran black with ink. For days, witnesses said. Some accounts claim months. The water itself became dark as the ink leached from hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, turning the Tigris into a flowing testament to everything that was being lost. Try to picture that. A river running black with the dissolved knowledge of civilizations. Everything Baghdad had collected, everything the translators had preserved, everything the scholars had created washing downstream and disappearing into the Persian Gulf. We know some of what was lost because other libraries in the Islamic world had copies of certain texts. But the unique works, the originals produced in Baghdad, the synthesis of knowledge from civilizations that had never been combined before, gone. The advanced mathematics from India that Baghdad had preserved, the centuries of Persian astronomical observations, the Chinese medical texts, the Islamic scholars' own revolutionary contributions, all of it thrown into the river. Some researchers whisper about a different story. They suggest that before the Mongols arrived, certain scholars knew what was coming, that they removed the most valuable texts, the most dangerous knowledge, and hid them somewhere safe. Secret libraries, hidden archives, knowledge waiting to be rediscovered. Whether that's true or wishful thinking, we may never know. What we know for certain is what was lost. And the river ran black with it. Baghdad and Alexandria get the attention because they fit the narrative we're comfortable with. Mediterranean civilizations, classical knowledge, the foundations of Western thought. But there were other libraries. Older ones, larger ones, in places that mainstream history barely acknowledges. And what they contained might have been the most dangerous knowledge of all. The Imperial Library of China dated back over 2,000 years. It was destroyed and rebuilt so many times that the pattern itself tells a story. Each time a new dynasty rose to power, one of the first acts was burning the previous dynasty's records. Not all of them, just the inconvenient ones. The histories that contradicted the new emperor's legitimacy, the philosophical works that suggested alternative forms of government, the texts that proved the current order wasn't inevitable, wasn't natural, wasn't the only way things could be. The most infamous burning came in 213 BC. Emperor Qin Shi Huang had just unified China through brutal conquest, and he understood something crucial about maintaining power. You don't just conquer territory, you conquer memory. He ordered every book in the empire burned except those dealing with medicine, agriculture, and divination. Everything else, philosophy, history, poetry, alternative political theories, turned to ash. Scholars who protested were executed. Some were buried alive. The emperor's reasoning was brutally honest. He said the past was whatever he declared it to be. Scholars who disagreed with his version of history were dangerous, and he was right from his perspective. If you erase alternative narratives, if you eliminate evidence that things were once different, you make your own power seem eternal and unchallengeable. China lost hundreds of schools of philosophical thought in that burning. We know Confucianism and Taoism because they survived, but there were dozens of others, complete systems of ethics and metaphysics and political organization, all gone because one emperor decided the past needed to be controlled. Move west to India. The libraries of Nalanda and Taxila were Buddhist university complexes that operated for over 1,000 years. These weren't just religious institutions. They were centers of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy. The collection at Nalanda was so vast that when invaders finally set it alight in 1193, witnesses said it burned for 3 months. 3 months of continuous fire to consume all that knowledge. What was lost there? Mathematical concepts that Europe wouldn't discover for another 500 years. The concept of zero as both placeholder and number developed independently in India, and then spread through the Islamic world while Europe was still struggling with Roman numerals. Buddhist philosophical texts representing thousands of years of systematic investigation into the nature of consciousness and reality. Meditation techniques, practices for altering perception, all of it documented with the same rigor that we apply to scientific research today. And all of it burned. Then there are the libraries we barely talk about at all. The Maya, the Aztec, the civilizations of Mesoamerica maintained extensive collections of bark paper books called codices, astronomy, mathematics, history, medicine. They had developed writing systems we still can't fully translate, recorded astronomical predictions of shocking accuracy, and maintained historical records that might push back the timeline of American civilization by thousands of years. The Spanish conquistadors and the priests who followed them burned it all. Systematically, deliberately. Bishop Diego de Landa kept meticulous records of what he destroyed. He listed titles. He described contents. He knew exactly what he was burning: languages, astronomical calculations, historical chronicles, and he burned it anyway. His reasoning? The books contained lies of the devil. Alternative spiritual systems couldn't be tolerated. Knowledge that didn't fit Christian cosmology had to be eliminated. Of the vast Maya library system, 4 codices survive. 4 out of thousands. The rest were burned in public ceremonies designed to break the spirit of the conquered people. And what was in those lost texts? We know from the 4 survivors that the Maya could predict astronomical events with accuracy we've only recently been able to verify. They had mathematical systems including zero, developed completely independently from the old world. Their historical records claimed civilizations and timelines that predate everything we're taught about American history. All of it, deliberately destroyed. The priests knew what they were burning. They recorded it. And they burned it anyway. The pattern holds. Libraries across the world, across centuries, all destroyed at the moment when new powers needed to eliminate alternative narratives. Now the question becomes unavoidable. What was actually in these libraries that made them so dangerous? Now we get to the part that should fundamentally disturb you. Because it's not just philosophical texts that burned. It's not just alternative histories or spiritual knowledge. The libraries contain technical manuals, engineering diagrams, precise instructions for building devices that mainstream archaeology insists shouldn't have been possible in the ancient world. And we know this because sometimes, rarely, the devices themselves survived even when the instruction manuals didn't. In 1901, divers found something impossible at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. A corroded lump of bronze gears, so encrusted with marine life that for decades no one could figure out what it was. Then, X-ray technology advanced enough to see inside without destroying it. What they found was a computer, not a simple abacus or counting device. A complex mechanical computer with over 30 interlocking bronze gears, built around 100 BC, capable of predicting astronomical events decades in advance, with shocking precision. They call it the Antikythera mechanism. And it's real. You can see it in a museum. But here's the problem. We have the device. We can study it, reconstruct how it worked, marvel at its sophistication. What we don't have are the texts explaining how to build it, the theoretical framework, the mathematical proofs underlying its design, the instruction manuals that would have allowed other craftsmen to create similar devices. Those texts were in Alexandria, and they burned. Ancient writers referenced Hero of Alexandria's inventions with a mix of awe and casual acceptance. Automated temple doors that opened when fires were lit on altars, wind-powered organs, steam-powered devices that modern historians dismiss as toys, as parlor tricks with no practical application. Except the surviving descriptions include mathematical precision, engineering specifications, details that suggest these weren't demonstrations but functional technology. And Hero's complete works, the texts describing devices beyond what survived, those were in the library too. Move forward in time. Greek fire changed medieval warfare completely. A substance the Byzantine Empire deployed from ships that could burn on water, that couldn't be extinguished by conventional means, that terrified every navy that encountered it. The formula was guarded so obsessively that when the empire finally fell, the knowledge died with it. Despite centuries of modern chemistry, despite detailed historical accounts of its effects, we still don't know exactly what it was or how they made it. References suggest the complete formula was recorded in Constantinople's libraries. Those collections were scattered and destroyed during the Fourth Crusade in 1204. The texts that survived were incomplete, fragmentary, useless for actual reconstruction. Then there's Damascus steel. Blades of legendary quality, so superior to European swords that crusaders wrote home in amazement about weapons that could cut through their armor and remain sharp after heavy use. The technique for creating this steel was lost around 1750. Modern metallurgists, using electron microscopes, have discovered the steel contains carbon nanotube structures that shouldn't be possible to create without technology the ancient world supposedly didn't possess. Ancient texts from Baghdad's House of Wisdom reportedly contain detailed descriptions of the forging process. Those texts were thrown into the Tigris River when the Mongols came. Now we have swords in museums that we can study but can't fully replicate. This is the pattern. Verifiable objects that prove ancient technological sophistication, and missing texts that would explain how that sophistication was achieved. The Antikythera mechanism isn't a myth or a hoax, it's sitting in a museum in Athens. Damascus steel blades exist in collections worldwide. The effects of Greek fire are documented in hundreds of historical accounts. These technologies were real, but the knowledge of how to create them? That burned. Specifically and conveniently, it burned at exactly the moments when libraries were being destroyed. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What if these aren't isolated examples of ancient ingenuity? What if they're glimpses of a more technologically advanced ancient world than we're taught to believe existed? What if the library burnings weren't just cultural tragedy but technological catastrophe, eliminating knowledge that could have accelerated human development by centuries? We're told human progress is linear, always forward, always advancing. But what if we've climbed these heights before, only to fall back down when the libraries burned? What if the Dark Ages weren't just about forgetting philosophy, but forgetting how to build the machines that philosophy had produced? The technologies are one thing. We can imagine rediscovering them eventually, piece by piece, through archaeology and analysis. But there was knowledge in those libraries that cuts even deeper. Knowledge about who we are, where we came from, and alternative timelines of human history that would completely rewrite everything we've been taught. That's what cuts deepest. Because when you erase history, you don't just destroy the past, you limit the future. You narrow what people can imagine as possible. There was a text called the Egyptiaca, written by an Egyptian priest named Manetho in the 3rd century BC. We have fragments, enough to know the complete work existed, enough to know what it contained. Manetho wrote a complete history of Egypt, but not the history you learned in school. His timeline went back 36,000 years before the first pharaoh. 36,000 years. Describing predecessor civilizations, divine kings, dynasties that ruled before what we consider the beginning of Egyptian civilization. Now, whether that's literally true or mythological, we'll never know, because the complete text burned. What we're left with are fragments preserved in other writers' works, pieces quoted, referenced, debated. But the full account, the detailed chronology, the explanation of who these pre-pharaonic civilizations were and what they achieved, gone. And with it, any chance of understanding how the ancient Egyptians themselves understood their origins, what their own records said about where they came from. The Babylonians had something similar. A priest named Berosus wrote a history called the Babylonica. The timeline in that work allegedly went back 432,000 years, describing antediluvian kings, rulers who lived before the flood that appears in so many ancient traditions. Pre-flood civilizations with impossibly long reigns and achievements that sound like mythology, but were treated as historical fact by the scholars who read the complete text. Again, we have only fragments. But what's interesting is how ancient historians reference these works. They didn't treat them as mythology or religious allegory. They cited them as historical sources. They debated their accuracy the way modern historians debate archaeological evidence, which means the complete texts contained something details, chronologies, evidence that made them credible to ancient scholars who had access to knowledge we don't. The Sumerian king lists follow the same pattern. The fragments that survive mix mythological figures with historically verified kings. But the early entries list reigns of impossible length, thousands of years for individual rulers. References suggest longer, more detailed versions of these lists existed in libraries. What did those complete versions contain? Explanations of the pre-flood world? Details about civilizations that existed before the catastrophe that nearly wiped humanity out? We'll never know. The texts burned. And then there are the alternative cosmologies. Aristarchus of Samos proposed that the Earth orbits the Sunday, not in vague philosophical terms, with mathematical proofs, with detailed calculations. 1800 years before Copernicus supposedly discovered heliocentrism, there was a Greek scholar who understood it completely and could demonstrate it mathematically. We know this because other writers criticized his model. They referenced his proofs. They debated his calculations. But the complete treatise? Lost. We don't have Aristarchus's detailed model of the solar system. We don't have the mathematical framework he used to prove the Earth's motion. We have second-hand descriptions, fragments, criticism from scholars who disagreed with him. The actual work that could have changed astronomy 18 centuries earlier than it did, that was in Alexandria. and it burned. This is historical revisionism at its most effective. Not just rewriting what happened, but eliminating evidence that things were ever different. The library burnings served as reset points, moments when inconvenient histories were erased, when alternative timelines disappeared, when single narratives could consolidate power without competition from other versions of the past. Because if you control what people know about history, you control what they believe is possible. You make your own version of reality seem inevitable. The only version, the true version. Everything else turns to ash, and within a few generations, people forget there were ever alternatives. But perhaps the most dangerous knowledge wasn't technological or historical. It was philosophical and spiritual. Ideas about the nature of reality, consciousness, and human potential that threatened every power structure that came after. And those texts? They were specifically targeted. For 2,000 years, the brightest minds in ancient Greece underwent secret initiations into what were called the mystery schools. Plato went through it, Aristotle, Cicero, men whose names we still study, whose ideas still shape Western thought. And every single one of them described the experience as the most profound moment of their lives. Knowledge that changed their entire understanding of existence, of consciousness, of what it meant to be human. The Eleusinian mysteries operated for nearly 2 millennia. Generation after generation of initiates experienced something so transformative that they spoke of it with reverence for the rest of their lives. But the actual teachings? Never written down. Or if they were written, those texts were destroyed so completely that not even fragments remain. We have descriptions of the impact. We have testimonies about the transformation. But the knowledge itself? Gone. Except that's not entirely true. References suggest that Alexandria's library contained related texts, philosophical works that expanded on the concepts taught in the mystery schools, detailed explorations of consciousness, reality, death, and transformation. Not mythology, not religious doctrine. Systematic investigation into the nature of human awareness itself. And those texts burned with everything else. The alchemical tradition follows the same pattern of loss, not the crude medieval European version obsessed with turning lead into gold. The real alchemical texts were philosophical treatises on transformation of matter, yes, but also of consciousness and perception. Arab scholars who worked at the House of Wisdom in Baghdad referenced Greek and Egyptian alchemical works that described processes and concepts. European alchemists would spend centuries trying to reconstruct from incomplete fragments. These weren't simple recipes for making gold. They were sophisticated investigations into the nature of physical reality, the relationship between consciousness and matter, the potential for human beings to alter their perception and understanding through specific practices and techniques. Whether the literal claims were true matters less than what the text represented. Systematic attempts to map the boundaries of human potential. Move east. Buddhist sources mention entire categories of sutras lost when Nalanda burned. Not just religious texts, but detailed documentation of contemplative practices developed over centuries. Meditation techniques. Methods for altering consciousness. Systematic investigations into the nature of mind and reality, conducted with the same rigor we associate with scientific research. The Yoga Sutras that survived are condensed, compressed. References suggest there were longer commentaries, alternative texts, detailed explanations of practices, and their effects on consciousness. Think about what that means. Thousands of years of documented exploration into human awareness, into altered states, into the relationship between mind and reality. All of it systematically recorded, and all of it lost when the libraries burned. Here's where it gets politically dangerous. These texts offered direct paths to understanding, techniques individuals could practice to access profound states of consciousness without institutional mediation. You didn't need a priest to interpret reality for you if you had methods to explore it yourself. You didn't need religious authority to validate your spiritual experiences if you had practices that reliably produced those experiences. That's why these texts were specifically targeted. Not because they were false, but because they were democratizing. Knowledge that empowers individuals threatens institutions built on controlling access to truth. If anyone could access transcendent states through techniques described in a text, why would they need intermediaries? Why would they accept that only ordained authorities could interpret the divine? The mystery school initiates described experiences that changed their understanding of existence. The alchemical texts explored transformation of consciousness as much as matter. The Buddhist sutras documented practices for directly investigating the nature of mind. All of this knowledge suggested that reality might be more malleable, more accessible, more open to individual exploration than any institution wanted to admit. So it burned. Deliberately. Systematically. Because the most dangerous knowledge isn't information about the external world. It's knowledge about the internal one. About human potential. About what individuals might be capable of if they had access to millennia of documented practice in expanding consciousness and altering perception. Now you might be thinking this was all just accidents of history. Wars happen, libraries burn, knowledge gets lost. Tragic but not conspiratorial. Except when you look at who destroyed these libraries and when a disturbing pattern emerges. When Christianity became Rome's official religion in the 4th century, one of the first imperial decrees had nothing to do with building churches or converting pagans through persuasion. It ordered the destruction of pagan temples, not their conversion, not their repurposing, their complete destruction, and the libraries inside them. They didn't call it book burning. They called it cleansing the world of demonic deception, purifying civilization of lies that had led humanity astray. But here's what makes it interesting. They kept detailed records, lists of what they destroyed, catalogues of which texts were burned and why. They knew exactly what they were erasing. This wasn't ignorant vandalism. It was systematic elimination of specific knowledge. Emperor Theodosius issued the decree in 391 AD. What remained of Alexandria's library was housed in the Serapeum, a temple complex dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis. Bishop Theophilus led the mobs personally. And what they targeted tells you everything about what threatened the new Christian order. Greek philosophical works that offered complete worldviews without requiring a single god. Aristotle's logic, the Stoics' ethics, Epicurean physics, all of it provided frameworks for understanding reality that didn't need scripture or divine revelation. Scientific texts were particularly dangerous. Observations of the natural world that explained phenomena through discoverable laws rather than divine intervention. If lightning could be understood through natural philosophy rather than God's wrath, if diseases had physical causes rather than spiritual ones, if the stars moved according to mathematical principles rather than divine will, then what exactly did people need the church for? And the historical records. This might have been the most threatening category of all. Texts that contradicted biblical chronology. Egyptian records, going back tens of thousands of years, when scripture claimed the world was only a few thousand years old. Alternative creation stories, competing flood narratives, evidence that civilization existed long before Genesis said it should have. All of it had to go. The pattern repeats everywhere. Christianity consolidated power. In Celtic lands, they systematically eliminated Druidic knowledge. The Druids didn't have libraries in the traditional sense, but they maintained extensive oral traditions and sacred texts. Christian authorities destroyed both, burning texts and forbidding the teaching of Druidic wisdom. Within a few generations, the knowledge was simply gone. Gnostic Christians faced the same fate. Alternative interpretations of Christ's teachings, texts that suggested different paths to salvation, gospels that didn't make it into the official canon. All of it burned as heresy. We only know Gnostic Christianity existed in such diversity because a few texts survived by accident, buried in jars, hidden in caves, forgotten until modern archaeologists stumbled upon them. Everything else was systematically destroyed by the Orthodox Church. The Manichaeans had entire libraries. a dualistic philosophy that rivaled Christianity for followers across the Roman Empire. Their texts explored the nature of good and evil, light and darkness, the structure of reality in ways that competed with Christian cosmology. Every library, every text, every manuscript, deliberately hunted down and destroyed over the course of centuries. We know the religion existed. We have historical records of its spread and influence. But the actual teachings? Almost entirely lost. Move forward in time. The Spanish Inquisition didn't just target people. It targeted books, Jewish texts, Islamic works preserved in Spain during the period of Moorish rule, any knowledge that contradicted Catholic doctrine. Systematic destruction. The conquistadors in the Americas followed the same playbook. Bishop Diego de Landa didn't accidentally burn the Maya libraries. He did it deliberately, methodically, keeping records of what he destroyed. His stated reason? The books contained lies of the devil. Alternative spiritual systems couldn't be tolerated. The pattern is unmistakable. When a religious movement gains political power, one of its first actions is destroying libraries that house competing explanations of reality. Not because those explanations were provably false, but because they offered alternatives. Different paths to truth. Different ways of understanding existence that didn't require submission to the new religious authority. In every case, the destroyers claimed they were eliminating dangerous lies, protecting humanity from deception, serving truth by burning books. But here's the question that changes everything. What if they were actually eliminating dangerous truths? What if the knowledge in those libraries was destroyed precisely because it was accurate, because it worked, because it offered real alternatives to institutional control? What if the book burnings weren't a war against falsehood, but a war against competing truths? But it wasn't just religious authorities. Some of the most systematic knowledge destruction was purely political. Empires that understood something fundamental about power, that controlling the past means controlling the future. And if you want absolute control over the present, you need to eliminate any evidence that things were ever different. China, 213 BC. Emperor Qin Shi Huang had just finished conquering the warring states and unifying them under his rule. He'd won the military campaign. But that wasn't enough. Because scattered across his new empire were libraries containing philosophies that questioned imperial authority, historical records of previous dynasties, alternative political systems, evidence that governance could take different forms, that emperors weren't inevitable, that the current order wasn't the only possible order. So he issued a decree that should be taught in every political science class, but somehow isn't. Every book in the empire except those dealing with medicine, agriculture, and divination was to be burned. Not hidden, not archived, burned. Scholars who protested were executed, some were buried alive. The emperor's reasoning was brutally, almost admirably honest. The past is what I say it is. Scholars who disagree with my version of history are dangerous. Therefore, eliminate the scholars and burn the evidence. And it worked. Hundreds of schools of philosophical thought existed in China before that burning. Complete systems of ethics, metaphysics, political organization. We know Confucianism and Taoism because they survived. But there were dozens of others, lost entirely because one emperor decided that alternative ways of thinking about governance threatened his authority. By eliminating the past, he tried to make his empire appear eternal, the only legitimate form of government, the inevitable result of history, rather than one outcome among many possibilities. Rome followed a similar pattern, though less explicitly. They adopted Greek knowledge when it was useful. They preserved texts that supported their cultural narrative. But the libraries of peoples they conquered, the Celtic records, the Etruscan archives, the Carthaginian collections, systematically destroyed or allowed to decay into oblivion. Now we know those civilizations only through Roman accounts, only through the conqueror's perspective. The conquered people's own histories, their own understanding of who they were erased. This wasn't accidental. This was strategy. Because if you eliminate a people's intellectual tradition, their connection to their own past, you make them easier to absorb into your empire. They can't rebel against your narrative if they have no alternative narrative to rebel with. Their history becomes whatever you say it was. Their identity becomes whatever you allow it to be. The Mongol destruction of Baghdad raises interesting questions. Was it simple barbarism? Anti-intellectual violence by nomadic warriors who didn't value written knowledge? Or was it more calculated than that? Some scholars argue the Mongols specifically targeted libraries because Islamic scholarship had created networks of ideas that unified resistance. Destroy the knowledge centers, and you fragment the opposition. Whether intentional or not, throwing hundreds of thousands of texts into the Tigris River accomplished exactly that. Even the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Christian crusaders sacked Constantinople instead of continuing to Jerusalem, resulted in the destruction of Byzantine libraries containing the last surviving copies of classical works. Whether the destruction was deliberate or just opportunistic looting gone wrong, the effect was the same. Knowledge that had been preserved in the Eastern Roman Empire for centuries suddenly disappeared, and what survived ended up concentrated in Western European hands. The pattern is clear across empires and centuries. Conquerors understand that you don't just need to defeat armies, you need to defeat memory. Alternative histories are dangerous because they prove that your order isn't inevitable, that things were different once, that they could be different again. So you burn the libraries, eliminate the records, and within a few generations, your version of history becomes the only version anyone remembers. But there's a third category of destruction, the most disturbing one. What if some knowledge was destroyed simply because it was too powerful, too dangerous for anyone to possess? Byzantine emperors had a rule about military secrets. If an invention was too powerful to lose, it was also too dangerous to keep. Think about the implications of that logic. If a weapon or technology threatened to destabilize all warfare, all kingdoms, all existing power structures, it was destroyed. They preferred humanity forget it entirely, rather than risk it spreading beyond their control. The formula for Greek fire eventually followed this exact path. Better to lose the knowledge completely than have it fall into the wrong hands. But what counts as the wrong hands? And what else did they destroy following that same logic? Ancient weapons technology was sometimes deliberately eliminated by the very civilizations that created it. Advanced metallurgy, siege engineering, chemical weapons texts describing these weren't always lost by accident. Some were destroyed intentionally when rulers recognized that certain knowledge, if it spread, would make defense impossible, would render fortifications obsolete, would shift the balance of power so dramatically that no existing empire could survive. Move into more ambiguous territory. Alchemical texts that medieval authorities destroyed weren't all symbolic mysticism. Some reportedly described actual processes, transmutation techniques, pharmaceutical preparations that could heal or poison depending on dosage, substances whose effects sounded too powerful to allow widespread access. Whether these worked as described almost doesn't matter. What matters is that authorities feared they might work. Feared what would happen if that knowledge became available to anyone who could read. Then there are the texts on consciousness alteration. Detailed descriptions of plants, preparation methods, dosages, and practices for inducing specific altered states. Ancient cultures documented these extensively, which plants produced which effects, how to prepare them safely, what mental states they could access. Some authorities saw this knowledge as spiritually dangerous, opening doors that should remain closed, inviting forces or experiences humanity wasn't meant to encounter. But others recognized a different danger, political danger, because populations that can alter their own consciousness independently are remarkably difficult to control. If people can access transcendent states, profound insights, or alternative perspectives on reality through techniques they can perform themselves, they become less dependent on institutions that claim to mediate those experiences. Churches lose authority when direct spiritual experience is available without priests. Governments lose control when citizens can step outside the accepted framework of reality and see it from the outside. Medical texts faced similar suppression. Not the general knowledge of setting bones or treating fever. The specific texts describing abortion techniques, contraceptive methods, herbal remedies that gave individuals, especially women, control over their own bodies. These weren't destroyed for being ineffective. Historical evidence suggests many of these techniques worked remarkably well. They were destroyed because they threatened patriarchal structures that depended on controlling reproduction and bodily autonomy. Here's where the pattern becomes truly disturbing. What if the most advanced texts, the mathematical works, the astronomical models, the consciousness exploration techniques, were destroyed by a kind of consensus? Not religious authorities versus political powers, but both working toward the same goal for different reasons. Both recognizing that certain knowledge, if widely available, would destabilize all existing institutions. Some knowledge might create what we could call anarchic freedom. Not chaos, but genuine independence from centralized control. If individuals could generate their own energy, heal their own illnesses, alter their own consciousness, access profound understanding, without institutional mediation, what would they need governments for? What would they need churches for? What hierarchy could maintain itself when the knowledge that created independence was freely available? So maybe the library burnings weren't just about eliminating competing narratives. Maybe they were about eliminating knowledge that made institutional control impossible. Maybe the most dangerous texts weren't the ones that contradicted official stories. Maybe they were the ones that offered actual alternatives, real tools for individual empowerment, genuine paths to independence. The question becomes unavoidable. Was the burning of libraries a war against falsehood, or a war against truths too dangerous to allow humanity to possess? But here's the thing about burning libraries. You can never destroy everything. Fragments survive. Copies escape. Memories persist. You can never destroy everything, no matter how thorough the purge, no matter how systematic the burning. And sometimes, what survives tells a story more revealing than what was lost. Because survival wasn't random. It required action, deliberate choices by people who understood what was coming. 1945. An Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali was digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi when his shovel struck something hard. A sealed jar, buried in the cliff face. Inside were 13 leather-bound books containing 52 texts. Gnostic Christian writings from the 3rd and 4th centuries, hidden right around the time Emperor Theodosius ordered the destruction of pagan temples and everything associated with them. Someone knew the purges were coming. Some scribe or group of scribes recognized that their version of Christianity, with its emphasis on direct spiritual knowledge, its alternative interpretations of Christ's teachings, its competing gospels, was about to be systematically erased. So they buried the texts in a jar and sealed it in a cliff, hoping that someday, somehow, someone would find what they'd preserved. 1600 years later, someone did. The texts that emerged from that jar completely changed our understanding of early Christianity. They proved that the religion wasn't the monolithic institution we'd been taught. There were competing interpretations, alternative scriptures, entirely different ways of understanding the divine. All of it had been destroyed everywhere else. Every copy burned, every alternative voice silenced. But this one jar survived because someone had the foresight to hide it. The Dead Sea Scrolls follow a similar pattern. Jewish texts from 200 BC to 70 AD, hidden in caves near Qumran right before the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and its libraries. The diversity of Second Temple Judaism revealed in those scrolls, the competing sects, the alternative interpretations of Scripture, the texts that didn't make it into the official canon. All of it would have been lost if someone hadn't hidden those manuscripts in desert caves, where they'd remain undiscovered for 2,000 years. Knowledge preservation in the ancient world required paranoia, required assuming that what you valued would be targeted. The Islamic Golden Age understood this instinctively. When scholars in Baghdad translated Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese texts into Arabic, they didn't keep single copies. They distributed the knowledge across a network of libraries: Spain, Cairo, Persia, North Africa. When the Mongols threw Baghdad's collection into the Tigris, certain texts survived because copies existed elsewhere. Not all the knowledge, not even most of it, but enough to prove what had existed. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, Greek scholars fled west carrying whatever manuscripts they could save. Those texts sparked the Renaissance in Italy. But here's the bitter irony: many of those Greek works had been destroyed in Western Europe centuries earlier during the Christian purges. They only survived because Byzantine libraries had preserved them in the East. Geographical accident. Pure luck that one branch of Christianity had been slightly less zealous about burning pagan knowledge than another. Sometimes survival is even stranger. In the early 1900s, scholars discovered a medieval prayer book. Nothing special, until someone noticed faint traces of older text beneath the prayers. It was a palimpsest parchment that had been scraped clean and reused. The original text had been erased to make room for religious writings. But modern imaging technology could recover what had been scraped away. Partial copies of Archimedes' works. Mathematical concepts centuries ahead of their time, hidden beneath prayers because parchment was expensive, and ancient mathematics seemed less valuable than scripture. The narrative thread runs through all of these survivals. People knew. Scribes, scholars, librarians. They recognized the value of what they were protecting. They understood that purges were coming, that knowledge would be targeted, that institutional powers would eliminate anything threatening their authority. So they hid texts in jars, in caves, in distributed networks across continents. They preserved knowledge at great personal risk, hoping future generations would find what they'd saved. And we did. Which proves something crucial. The forbidden knowledge existed. This isn't myth or speculation. Sometimes we don't even have the texts themselves, just references to them. Ancient writers quoting from books that no longer exist, describing knowledge that sounds impossible for their time period. Debating ideas found in scrolls that turned to ash centuries ago. And when modern scholars piece together these references, when they reconstruct what the lost texts must have contained based on how other writers engaged with them, that's when it gets really interesting. Because when we check those reconstructions against modern science, against what we've only recently discovered or verified, the ancient texts were right. Take Aristarchus of Samos. We don't have his treatise on heliocentrism, but we have Archimedes describing it in enough detail to reconstruct the basic argument. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth orbits the Sun and rotates on its own axis. He calculated the relative distances between the Earth, Moon, and Sunday. He created a mathematical model of the solar system, with the Sun at its center, 1800 years before Copernicus supposedly made the same discovery. Why don't we credit Aristarchus? Because his detailed mathematical proofs were in texts that burned. We're left with second-hand descriptions, with summaries from writers who mostly disagreed with him. The other scholars of his time dismissed the heliocentric model as absurd. And without the original treatise to prove otherwise, that dismissal became the accepted narrative. It took nearly 2 millennia before someone independently rediscovered what Aristarchus had already known and proven. The lost plays of ancient Greece can almost be reconstructed from references. Other playwrights quoted them. Critics analyzed them. Audiences discussed them. We can piece together plot points, character arcs, thematic elements from dozens of plays by Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus that no longer exist in complete form, which makes the loss somehow more painful. We know exactly what we're missing. We can almost see the shape of the absent masterpiece through the references that surround it. Move into practical knowledge. Pliny the Elder, Dioscorides, Galen, all of them reference earlier botanical and medical texts when describing plant preparations and their effects. They cite sources, they build on previous research, they reference detailed pharmacological knowledge from texts that are now completely lost. Modern ethnobotanists have verified some of these preparations by cross-referencing the surviving fragments. The medicines worked. The dosages were accurate. The ancient physicians knew exactly what they were documenting, which means the complete texts they were referencing, the detailed pharmaceutical compendia, the extensive botanical research, the medical knowledge accumulated over centuries, all of that was even more sophisticated than what survived in summary form. We're reading the footnotes to research papers that no longer exist, and the footnotes alone suggest the original research was extraordinary. Then there's what scholars call ghost mathematics. Advanced mathematical concepts mentioned in passing by ancient writers, suggesting entire lost treatises on subjects that supposedly weren't explored until much later. References to work on infinity, on irrational numbers, on concepts that sound remarkably like early calculus. We can't prove these texts existed in the form described, but we can prove that ancient mathematicians were engaging with ideas far more advanced than the surviving mathematical texts would suggest. The most intriguing references involve ancient maps. The Piri race map from 1513 reportedly copied information from much older sources. It shows Antarctic coastline with remarkable accuracy, coastline that should have been under ice for thousands of years. Either the map is copying from sources that predate the ice coverage, or ancient explorers had geographical knowledge we're told they couldn't have possessed. Either way, the references point to lost geographical understanding. This is intellectual archaeology, reconstructing what must have existed based on the holes it left behind. And the pattern that emerges is disturbing. We can prove that sophisticated knowledge existed even without the original texts. We can demonstrate through references and citations that ancient scholars possessed understanding that mainstream history claims they couldn't have had. Which raises the obvious question. If the references proved accurate, if the reconstructions verify advanced knowledge, what was in the complete text that disappeared entirely? What knowledge left no references at all? References and fragments give us clues, but sometimes we get something even more concrete. Physical artifacts that shouldn't exist according to mainstream timelines. Objects that require knowledge we're told hadn't been discovered yet. And when archaeologists find these, the artifacts themselves become evidence of what was in the libraries that burned. 1901. Divers exploring a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera brought up a corroded lump of bronze. For 70 years it sat in museums while scholars tried to figure out what it was. The corrosion was so severe that the internal structure was invisible. Then, X-ray technology advanced enough to see inside without destroying the object. What they found changed everything. It was a computer. Not a simple counting device. A complex mechanical computer with over 30 bronze gears precisely machined and interlocked, built around 100 BC, and it could predict astronomical events, eclipses, planetary positions, even the dates of the Olympic Games decades in advance with accuracy we couldn't match until the 1900s. Ancient texts had referenced such devices. Writers described Archimedes and others, building mechanical models of the heavens. Historians dismissed these references as exaggeration, as mythology, as ancient writers not understanding what they were seeing. Then, we found one, and it was more sophisticated than the texts had suggested. The ancient writers weren't exaggerating. They were understating the technology. Move forward in time. Archaeologists excavating sites in Iraq found clay jars dating from 200 BC to 200 AD. Strange construction, a copper cylinder, an iron rod, sealed with asphalt. When tested, they function as primitive electrochemical cells, batteries. Ancient texts reference divine lights in temples, metal plating techniques that require electrical current. Historians assumed these were metaphorical or magical thinking, but the artifacts suggest the texts were describing real technology. Roman concrete structures have lasted 2,000 years. The Pantheon's dome stands perfect after 2 millennia while modern concrete bridges crumble within decades. Recent analysis using electron microscopes revealed why. The Romans used volcanic ash in a specific ratio that creates crystalline structures, allowing the concrete to actually heal its own cracks over time. This technique was described in Vitruvius's surviving architectural writings, but Vitruvius was summarizing earlier, more detailed treatises that are now lost. The artifacts prove the knowledge existed. The texts that fully explained it are gone. Surgical instruments excavated from Roman medical sites match the descriptions in Galen's medical texts with perfect precision. But Galen was compiling knowledge from earlier physicians whose complete works disappeared. The tools prove that sophisticated surgical knowledge existed before what survived in writing. They're physical evidence of the lost medical texts that Galen referenced, but that we'll never read. Then there's the Saqqara bird, a wooden object from ancient Egypt, dated to around 200 BC, discovered in 1898 and catalogued as a bird figurine. Except when aerodynamics experts examined it a century later, they realized it functions as a glider. The weight distribution, the wing shape, the tail design, all aerodynamically sound. Egyptian texts reference flying in contexts historians always assumed were metaphorical. But this artifact suggests they had at least theoretical understanding of flight principles. The pattern repeats. Archaeology keeps vindicating what seemed like impossible claims. The Antikythera mechanism proved ancient texts about mechanical computers weren't myth. The Baghdad batteries suggest references to electrical phenomena were describing real technology. Roman concrete demonstrates that engineering knowledge we're only now recovering was documented in texts that burned. Every out-of-place artifact is a glimpse of what was described in libraries that no longer exist. Physical proof that the lost knowledge was real, which makes their destruction even more tragic, even more suspicious. But here's the part that should keep you up at night. Not all the libraries were destroyed. Some still exist, hidden, sealed, and protected by powers that don't want you to know what's inside. The Vatican has a library, not the public one where tourists take photographs of frescoed ceilings and ancient manuscripts behind glass. A different one. The Vatican Secret Archives, or as they've recently renamed it, trying to sound less ominous, the Vatican Apostolic Archives. But the name change doesn't alter what it actually is. 85 kilometers of shelving, that's not a metaphor. 85 kilometers of documents, scrolls, books, correspondence, and texts accumulated over 1,200 years of institutional power. 35,000 volumes in the catalogue alone. And access? Heavily restricted. Only accredited scholars studying specific approved topics can enter. They can request 3 items per day. 3. From 85 kilometers of material. Many sections remain completely off limits, regardless of credentials or research topic. The Church's own historians admit they haven't fully catalogued everything in the collection. Think about that. The institution that owns the archive doesn't completely know what's in it, or claims not to know. Which raises the obvious question: if they don't know what's there, how do they know what to keep restricted? What's confirmed to be inside reads like a greatest hits of Western history. Letters from Michelangelo. The trial documents of Galileo, complete records of his interrogation and forced recantation. Correspondence between popes and monarchs spanning centuries. Papal bulls, decrees, and communications that shaped European politics and religious doctrine. This is the verified, acknowledged content. The material they're willing to discuss. But what else is there? When Constantinople fell in 1453, Byzantine libraries were looted and scattered. Much of that collection ended up in Western Europe, and significant portions were transferred to Rome. Greek philosophical texts, astronomical treatises, scientific works that had survived in the Eastern Empire, while their Western copies burned, all flowing into Vatican control. How much of that material remains catalogued versus archived in restricted sections? The Spanish Inquisition kept meticulous records. When they confiscated Jewish texts, Islamic scientific works, and heretical Christian writings, they documented what they seized. Some was burned publicly. But church records suggest certain texts were archived rather than destroyed. Too valuable to lose entirely, too dangerous to allow public access. Where did those texts go? The conquistadors in the Americas sent artifacts and codices back to Rome. We know this from their own correspondence. They described Maya, astronomical texts, Aztec historical records, indigenous knowledge they were shipping to church authorities. What happened to those materials? A few pieces ended up in European museums. But the bulk of what was confiscated? No clear accounting. Then there's the 75-year rule. Documents aren't made available to researchers until 75 years after their creation. Recently reduced from a full century, as if that makes it more transparent. The official explanation is protecting living persons who might be mentioned in the documents. But critics point out this conveniently means anything from 1949 or later remains sealed. World War II documents, Cold War correspondence, modern diplomatic communications, all locked away from scrutiny. Some researchers who've been granted access to restricted sections describe strange experiences, finding references to texts that don't appear in the official catalogue, stumbling across fragments of works they shouldn't have encountered in the sections they were approved to study. One scholar claimed to have seen portions of Gnostic Gospels that weren't among those discovered at Nag Hammadi. Another described Islamic scientific manuscripts from Baghdad and Cordoba that mainstream history assumes were completely destroyed. These accounts are impossible to verify. The Vatican doesn't allow researchers to discuss what they find in detail without approval. Confidentiality agreements are standard, which means anything truly controversial discovered in the archives could be suppressed simply by denying the researcher permission to publish. The archive at least admits it exists. That alone makes it unusual among rumored repositories of hidden knowledge. We can point to a building in Vatican City and say with certainty there's restricted knowledge inside. The question is only what knowledge and why the restriction. If the public-facing rare book library contains treasures, illuminated manuscripts, ancient texts, priceless historical documents, what's in the sections they won't let anyone see? What did the Church collect over 12 centuries of institutional power that they still consider too dangerous or too valuable to share? But the Vatican's archive at least admits it exists. There are other libraries, ancient ones, that have passed into legend. Libraries that supposedly contain knowledge from before recorded history. Most scholars dismiss them as myth, as wishful thinking, as alternative history fantasy with no basis in reality. But every few decades, someone finds evidence suggesting they might be real. Or at least, that the legends are based on something. The Hall of Records. If you've spent any time in alternative history circles, you've heard of it. A chamber supposedly hidden beneath the Sphinx, or somewhere in the Giza Plateau, containing the complete knowledge of a lost civilization. The story comes from Edgar Cayce, the so-called sleeping prophet, who in the 1930s claimed psychic visions of an Atlantean library buried beneath the Sphinx. Complete history of human civilization going back over 10,000 years. Advanced technology. Spiritual knowledge. All preserved and waiting to be discovered. Mainstream archaeology dismisses this entirely. No evidence. Pure speculation based on supposed psychic visions. Case closed. Except for a few inconvenient details that keep the theory alive. In the 1990s, researchers conducted seismic studies and ground-penetrating radar surveys around the Sphinx. Standard archaeological practice. Non-invasive ways to see what's beneath the surface before you start digging. And they found anomalies. Large chambers or voids beneath and around the Sphinx. Empty spaces that shouldn't be there, according to conventional understanding of the site's construction. Egyptian authorities acknowledged the findings, then immediately restricted the site and stopped all further investigation. No excavation of the chambers, no follow-up studies. Just an acknowledgement that yes, there appear to be hollow spaces beneath one of the world's most studied monuments. And no, we're not going to explore them. To this day, those chambers remain unexcavated, and Egyptian officials won't explain why. Then there's the age question. The inventory stela, an ancient inscription, claims the Sphinx existed before Khafre, the pharaoh conventionally credited with building it. If true, that would make the Sphinx significantly older than mainstream Egyptology allows. And there's the water erosion. Geologist Robert Schoch examined the Sphinx and argued that weathering patterns indicate water erosion, not wind erosion. In a desert, which would require the Sphinx to have been built during a period when the Giza Plateau received significantly more rainfall thousands of years before dynastic Egypt. Mainstream Egyptologists reject Schoch's analysis. They have alternative explanations for the erosion patterns, but the debate itself reveals something interesting. If the Sphinx is thousands of years older than we think, if it predates the pharaohs entirely, then who built it? And what knowledge did they possess? Researchers who've worked in Egypt sometimes tell stories off the record. About antiquities officials finding sealed chambers during restoration work or excavation. About discoveries that don't get announced. About sealed doors and unexplored passages that official reports never mention. Whether these stories are true or embellished or complete fabrication is impossible to verify, but they persist. And there's a pattern worth noting. Every ancient civilization has legends of antediluvian libraries, knowledge preserved from before the flood. The Egyptians reference the books of Thoth divine wisdom from before the pharaohs. The Sumerians had their pre-flood king lists. The Greeks had their Atlantis myths. Different cultures, different continents, same basic story. Knowledge from a previous age, hidden and waiting to be rediscovered. Maybe these are just myths. Universal archetypes. Human psychology creating similar stories independently across cultures because we're all afraid of losing knowledge, afraid of catastrophe, erasing what we've learned. Or maybe the legends are corrupted memories of something real. Fragments of accurate history passed down through so many generations that the truth became indistinguishable from mythology. The Hall of Records remains unproven. No one's opened a chamber beneath the Sphinx and found ancient libraries. But the anomalies detected by ground-penetrating radar are real. The restricted investigation is real. And the pattern of legends across civilizations pointing to hidden pre-flood knowledge is undeniable. Egypt isn't the only place with these legends. In the mountains of Tibet, traditions speak of underground chambers containing the complete knowledge of civilizations that existed before the last ice age. And unlike the Hall of Records, people claim to have actually seen this one. Shambhala, a hidden kingdom somewhere in Central Asia, protected by mountains, accessible only to the worthy, containing a complete library of human spiritual and scientific knowledge preserved from civilizations that existed before the last ice age. Most scholars file this under mythology, pure legend with no historical basis. Except the Nazis believed it was real. In the 1930s and 40s, Heinrich Himmler sent multiple expeditions to Tibet, specifically searching for Shambhala and its library. These weren't casual exploratory missions. They were organized, funded operations with specific objectives. The SS devoted considerable resources to finding this hidden repository of ancient knowledge. Which raises the obvious question, what intelligence did they have? What made them believe a mythological hidden kingdom was worth the expense and effort of repeated expeditions into some of the most remote terrain on Earth? We don't have clear answers. The Nazi expedition's findings remain murky, their reports incomplete or lost. But the fact that they went at all suggests they had reasons beyond mythology. Move to verified ground. The Potala Palace in Lhasa, the former residence of the Dalai Lama, built on a mountain, containing extensive libraries of Buddhist texts. Some of these manuscripts date back over 1,000 years, authenticated, catalogued, studied by scholars. This isn't legend. This is documented fact. Tibet preserved knowledge. Then the Chinese invaded in 1950. Many monasteries were destroyed, libraries burned, but Tibetan lamas claim that certain texts were never in public monasteries to begin with. The most esoteric knowledge, the most dangerous or sacred teachings, were kept elsewhere. remote mountain caves accessible only to initiated practitioners, hidden repositories that invaders couldn't find because they didn't know where to look. Can we verify this? Not easily, but we have accounts from early Western explorers who spent years in Tibet before the Chinese invasion. Alexandre David Nail, a French explorer who lived in Tibetan monasteries in the early 20th century, described being shown ancient texts that contained histories and practices not found in known Buddhist literature. Nicholas Roerich, a Russian explorer and artist, documented similar experiences. Texts describing cosmologies, timelines, and techniques that didn't match anything in the established Buddhist canon. Were they shown genuine ancient manuscripts or elaborate fabrications? Were they interpreting what they saw through their own cultural biases and expectations? Impossible to say with certainty. But their accounts suggest that knowledge existed in Tibet, beyond what made it into Western scholarly understanding. Then there's the Mogao Caves. Not legend, verified archaeological fact. In 1900, a Chinese monk discovered a hidden door in one of the caves. Behind it was a library. 50,000 manuscripts, perfectly preserved, sealed away since the 11th century. 900 years. Hidden in plain sight in a cave system that monks and travelers had been visiting for centuries. And nobody knew it was there until someone found the door by accident. If a library containing 50,000 manuscripts could remain hidden for 9 centuries in a relatively accessible cave system, what else might be hidden in truly remote locations? The Himalayas and the mountains of Central Asia contain thousands of caves, monasteries in locations so remote they've never been fully surveyed by Western archaeologists, and religious traditions with continuous lineages going back millennia. Chinese legends tell of imperial libraries sealed in mountain chambers when dynasties fell. Rather than allow knowledge to fall into invaders' hands, emperors allegedly ordered certain texts removed from the capital and hidden in secure locations. Sealed chambers with preserved documents, waiting for the dynasty to be restored. Except the dynasties never were restored, and the locations of the sealed libraries died with the people who hid them. These are just legends, unverified stories, but the pattern is consistent, and the Mogao discovery proves that large caches of ancient texts can remain hidden for centuries, only to be discovered by accident. So we have proven hidden libraries. The Vatican admits it exists but restricts access. Mogao proved that libraries can hide in plain sight for centuries, and we have strong evidence of chambers beneath the Sphinx that remain unexcavated. But here's the question that changes everything. What if the knowledge in ancient libraries wasn't just old, but dangerous? What if there are things humanity genuinely isn't ready to know? And what if some group has been protecting us from that knowledge or protecting that knowledge from us? That's the question that should disturb your sleep, because the implications cut deeper than historical curiosity or archaeological mystery. The lost knowledge has practical consequences, real-world implications that affect how we live today, what we can build, what we can cure, what we understand about the world around us. Consider what we've already discussed. Roman concrete that lasts 2,000 years while our modern bridges crumble within decades. We recently rediscovered their technique using electron microscopes and materials science. It required cutting-edge technology to understand what they knew 2 millennia ago. The formula was in their engineering texts. Detailed instructions for creating self-healing concrete using volcanic ash in specific ratios. Those texts burned. And for centuries, we built inferior structures, watched them decay, rebuilt them, never understanding that the solution had already been discovered and documented and lost. How many bridges collapsed? How many buildings failed? How many infrastructure projects consumed resources building things designed to fall apart, when the instructions for building things that last forever were sitting in a library until someone set it on fire? Damascus steel tells the same story. Blades of legendary quality that could cut through European swords and remain sharp after heavy combat. The technique was lost around 1750, right when the last libraries containing the detailed metallurgical texts were destroyed or scattered. Modern metallurgists have partially recreated the process using electron microscopy and nanotechnology. They've discovered the steel contains carbon nanotube structures that shouldn't be possible to create without technology the ancient world supposedly didn't possess. But even with our advanced analysis, we can't fully replicate the original blades. The complete texts describing the exact process burned in Baghdad when the Mongols came. Medicine offers perhaps the most tragic examples. Ancient pharmacological texts reference surgical techniques and herbal preparations we're only now rediscovering through ethnobotany and archaeology. Willow bark as the source of aspirin. Foxglove for heart conditions. Countless other plant-based medicines that modern pharmaceutical companies have validated and synthesized. But these were the simple preparations, the ones that survived in fragmentary references. What about the complex pharmaceutical knowledge? The preparations requiring multiple ingredients in specific ratios, processed in particular ways, combined according to techniques that took generations to develop. Those texts burned, and we're left trying to rediscover through trial and error what was already systematically documented. How many people died from conditions that ancient physicians knew how to treat? How many treatments did we lose that we haven't even begun to rediscover? The environmental and agricultural implications might be even more profound. Ancient texts described sustainable farming techniques, crop rotation systems, water management strategies that modern agriculture has spent centuries trying to redevelop, and we're still learning. The Nazca civilization built aqueduct systems so efficient they're still functional today. Roman aqueducts delivered clean water to millions without electric pumps, without the energy-intensive infrastructure we consider necessary. The engineering texts explaining these systems exist only in fragments. Think about what that means practically. We're facing water scarcity, agricultural sustainability challenges, infrastructure decay. And somewhere in the ashes of ancient libraries were detailed solutions to these exact problems. Not theoretical solutions. Proven techniques that civilizations used successfully for centuries. We could have been building better from the start if that knowledge had survived. The loss isn't abstract historical tragedy. It's practical setback. If those libraries had survived, we might be centuries more advanced in materials science, medicine, architecture, sustainable technology. Every breakthrough we celebrate as modern progress might be nothing more than painful rediscovery of what was already known and documented and lost. How much of what we call advancement is actually just recovering ground that humanity already covered? How many times have we climbed these same heights of understanding, achieved these same insights, developed these same solutions only to lose everything when the libraries burned and have to start over from nothing? The technological loss is frustrating, but at least it's recoverable. We're proving that every time we rediscover an ancient technique through modern science. But there's another category of lost knowledge that might be gone forever. Understanding of consciousness, human potential, and the nature of reality itself. And that loss might be even more devastating than any technology we could rebuild. Because technology can be rediscovered. You can reverse engineer a blade, analyze concrete, experiment with metallurgy until you stumble back onto what was known before. But wisdom traditions don't work that way. They require continuous transmission, teacher to student, generation to generation. An unbroken chain of practice and understanding passed down through direct experience and guided instruction. When that chain breaks, the knowledge doesn't just become harder to access. It disappears completely. Buddhist texts lost when Nalanda burned for 3 months represented over 1,500 years of systematic investigation into the nature of mind and consciousness. Not religious dogma, not mystical speculation. Methodical, rigorous documentation of what happens to human awareness under specific conditions. Which practices produce which states? Which techniques reliably alter perception? How consciousness can be trained, shaped, expanded. Modern neuroscience is discovering fragments of what those contemplatives documented. Meditation physically alters brain structure. Consciousness is far more malleable than we assumed. Perception isn't direct reception of reality, but active construction by the mind. Ancient texts described all of this in sophisticated detail, along with practical techniques for working with these discoveries. What didn't survive might have included methods and frameworks for exploring consciousness that we don't even have concepts for today. The mystery school initiates Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, minds whose fragmentary surviving works still shape Western thought, all described their initiations as the most profound experiences of their lives. Knowledge that fundamentally changed their understanding of existence. But the actual teachings, the methods used to produce those transformative experiences, gone. Destroyed so completely that we can't even reconstruct them from references. Modern psychology is exploring some of this territory. Psychedelic research is investigating altered states. Consciousness studies are beginning to map the varieties of human awareness. But we're starting from scratch, building from zero, rather than continuing from where ancient practitioners left off after millennia of documented experimentation. Move to philosophy. Before the Chinese book burnings, over 300 distinct schools of thought existed. Complete philosophical systems, each offering different approaches to ethics, metaphysics, social organization, human flourishing. We know Confucianism and Taoism because they survived. They were useful to later rulers, so they were preserved, but hundreds of other complete philosophical systems were eradicated. We have fragments suggesting some were radically different from anything that survived. Alternative ways of thinking about time, causality, the relationship between individual and society, the nature of the good life. What perspectives on human existence did we lose? What approaches to organizing civilization? What insights into meaning and purpose that didn't fit the narratives of those who came to power? Then there are the lost cosmologies. Ancient texts hint at ways of understanding the universe that don't match our current models. Cyclical time rather than linear progression. Multiple dimensions or realms of existence. Interconnectedness between consciousness and physical reality. Ideas that sound like mysticism until you notice quantum physics and modern philosophy are beginning to articulate similar concepts using different language. Were these ancient cosmologies accurate descriptions of reality? Metaphorical frameworks? Something in between? We'll never know because the detailed texts explaining them burned. We're left with fragments, hints, suggestions that ancient thinkers were grappling with questions about the nature of reality that we're only now beginning to ask in modern terms. Here's the fundamental difference. You can excavate a device and reverse engineer its technology. You can analyze ancient concrete and rediscover its formula. You can study artifacts and reconstruct lost techniques. But you can't excavate enlightenment. You can't carbon date understanding. You can't reverse engineer wisdom from fragments. When contemplative traditions break, when philosophical lineages end, when the texts documenting centuries of inner exploration burn, that knowledge is gone in ways that technological knowledge isn't. The loss is permanent, irreversible. We can mourn it, but we can't recover it. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Were ancient contemplatives and philosophers further along in understanding consciousness and reality than we are today? Have we advanced technologically while regressing in wisdom? Did the library burnings create a civilization that knows how to build better tools, but has forgotten how to use them wisely? But there's a third category, the most disturbing one. What if some of the lost knowledge was deliberately kept from humanity because we're not ready for it? What if the library burnings weren't just destruction, but a kind of quarantine? A deliberate containment of information too powerful, too destabilizing, too dangerous for any civilization to possess? This is where we move from documented history into uncomfortable speculation. But the question deserves consideration, because there's historical precedent for exactly this kind of thinking. Byzantine emperors had an explicit policy about military secrets. If an invention was too powerful to risk losing, it was also too dangerous to keep. Weapons or technologies that threatened to destabilize all existing power structures were destroyed rather than archived. The reasoning was brutally practical. Better that humanity forget such knowledge entirely than risk it spreading beyond control. Greek fire eventually followed this exact trajectory. When the empire fell, the formula died with it, deliberately, because those who possessed it decided that was preferable to the alternative. But what if this logic extended beyond weapons technology? Ancient sources reference eternal flames and divine lights in temples. Some of these can be explained through natural gas seeps or simple oil lamps. But other references describe portable light sources, power generation, energy systems that don't align with our understanding of ancient technological capabilities. If some civilization had discovered methods of generating energy that were sustainable, decentralized, accessible to anyone with the knowledge that would fundamentally undermine every power structure based on energy scarcity and control, would such knowledge be preserved? Or would it be recognized as existentially threatening to any centralized authority and systematically eliminated? Move into medicine and longevity. Ancient texts reference pharmaceutical preparations and practices that supposedly extended lifespan far beyond normal human limits. Alchemical works most now lost describe transformation processes that sound like pure fantasy. Turning lead into gold was symbolic, yes, but the texts also claimed practical techniques for extending life, for healing conditions considered terminal, for fundamentally altering human biological limitations. Most scholars dismiss these as metaphor or delusion, but some of history's greatest minds took these texts seriously, studied them obsessively, guarded them carefully, then every copy burned. If it was pure fantasy, harmless pseudoscience, why destroy it so thoroughly? Why hunt down every manuscript describing these processes? Consider the implications if even a fraction of those claims were accurate. Medical knowledge that could dramatically extend human lifespan would destabilize every social and economic system built on generational turnover. Inheritance laws, retirement structures, political succession, resource allocation, all of it assumes that people die on relatively predictable timelines. What happens to those systems if lifespans double, triple, become indefinite? Then there's consciousness itself. Lost texts describing techniques for expanding perception, for accessing information through non-ordinary means, for altering reality through focused awareness. Whether these capabilities are literally true or sophisticated, placebo effects almost doesn't matter from a power control perspective, because knowledge that allows individuals to access profound altered states independently is fundamentally democratizing. Religious institutions lose authority when direct, transcendent experience is available without priestly mediation. Political structures lose control when citizens can alter their own consciousness and perception at will. Economic systems falter when people can generate states of profound well-being internally, rather than pursuing them through consumption. The knowledge itself becomes threatening regardless of whether its claims are objectively true. Perhaps the most profound lost knowledge wasn't about what's out there in the external world, astronomy, geography, distant lands. Perhaps it was about what's in here, human potential, consciousness, the relationship between awareness and physical reality. And perhaps that's exactly the knowledge most systematically targeted for elimination. Not because it was false, but because it was democratizing. Because it offered tools for individual empowerment that made institutional control difficult or impossible. If you were an emperor, a pope, a ruling elite encountering texts describing how any individual could access altered states, generate sustainable energy, heal themselves without expert intervention, what would you do? Preserve that knowledge for all humanity, or recognize it as an existential threat to your authority and destroy it before it could spread? The library burnings might not have been vandalism or ignorance. They might have been rational policy, difficult decisions about what knowledge humanity should possess and what should be eliminated for the stability of civilization itself. Of course, all of this raises the ultimate question: Can we get this knowledge back? Is it truly lost forever? Or are there ways through archaeology, through technology, through unconventional research to recover what burned? And if we did recover it, would we even be allowed to share it? The answer to the first question is more hopeful than you might expect. Because right now, in laboratories around the world, lost knowledge is returning from the dead. Herculaneum, a Roman town buried by Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, frozen in time alongside Pompeii. But unlike Pompeii, Herculaneum had something extraordinary, a villa containing an entire library, hundreds of scrolls carbonized by the volcanic heat, turned into solid black cylinders harder than charcoal. For 2,000 years, these scrolls sat in museums completely unreadable. Any attempt to physically unroll them would reduce them to powder. The knowledge inside Greek philosophical texts, works we'd never seen before, was technically preserved but completely inaccessible. Then technology caught up. CT scans that can see inside without touching. Artificial intelligence trained to recognize ink patterns in three-dimensional scans of carbonized material. Machine learning algorithms that can virtually unwrap scrolls that would disintegrate if physically opened. And it's working. We're reading texts that have been unreadable for 2 millennia. Philosophical works that were completely unknown. Lost knowledge literally returning from what everyone assumed was permanent destruction. And we're just beginning. As of now, we've barely scratched the surface of what's in that library. Every scroll that gets virtually unwrapped could contain something revolutionary. Something that changes our understanding of ancient philosophy, science, or daily life. The knowledge was never destroyed. It was just waiting for technology to advance far enough to access it. The Oxyrhynchus papyri tell a similar story of ongoing discovery. In the late 1800s, archaeologists excavating an ancient Egyptian rubbish dump found over 500,000 fragments of texts, garbage, discarded writing that had been thrown away and buried in desert sand. And they're still being translated and published today. Over a century later, new discoveries keep emerging from those fragments. Lost poems by Sappho discovered in the early 2000s, unknown gospels, scientific treatises, historical documents. Each fragment a piece of the puzzle, and the puzzle is so vast that we're still finding new pieces after more than 100 years of study. This proves something crucial. Massive amounts of ancient writing survive in fragmentary form, scattered across archaeological sites, waiting to be found and interpreted. Move underwater. The Mediterranean is a library in the sea. Every ancient ship that sank carrying books, scrolls, or tablets represents a potential rediscovery. The Antikythera wreck gave us the mechanism. What else is down there in sealed containers, protected by the ocean for millennia? Modern remote sensing technology can now map the seafloor with extraordinary precision. Submersibles can reach depths that were impossible decades ago. Underwater archaeology is finding shipwrecks we never knew existed, and some of them might contain texts sealed well enough to survive 2,000 years underwater. Climate change, for all its devastation, is revealing archaeological sites that have been hidden for millennia. Melting ice exposing artifacts and potentially texts that have been frozen since antiquity. Shifting sands uncovering ruins that were buried for centuries. Drought revealing structures that were underwater. Each environmental change creates opportunities for discovery alongside the destruction. And then there's digital reconstruction. AI trained on fragmentary texts can predict missing words with increasing accuracy. Machine learning algorithms can piece together scattered fragments, identifying which pieces belong together even when they're found in different locations. Technology is allowing us to reconstruct damaged manuscripts, to read palimpsests where text was scraped away and written over, to recover knowledge from sources that seemed hopelessly corrupted. The loss isn't permanent. The knowledge isn't gone forever. Every decade brings discoveries that expand our understanding of what ancient civilizations knew. Technology is racing forward, creating new methods for accessing texts that seemed lost, for recovering information from damaged sources, for piecing together the fragmentary survival of what once filled entire libraries. The question isn't whether we can recover lost knowledge. We're already doing it. The question is whether we'll be allowed to keep what we find. But archaeology is only recovering fragments and physical texts. There's another approach, one that sounds controversial but has proven surprisingly effective. Studying oral traditions, indigenous knowledge, and ancient practices that survived outside the written record. Because not all knowledge was in libraries. Some of it was deliberately kept away from written form, passed through living transmission, embedded in practice and culture and memory. Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime stories encode astronomical knowledge, navigation techniques, and historical events with precision that Western scholarship dismissed as impossible for millennia. Mythology, they said, symbolic narratives with no factual basis. Then researchers started checking the stories against geological and astronomical records, and the stories were accurate. Aboriginal oral traditions describe coastlines from 10,000 years ago, before rising seas changed the geography at the end of the last ice age. They preserve precise information about land bridges that existed, islands that disappeared, coastal features that were submerged when the oceans rose. For 10,000 years, this knowledge passed from generation to generation without ever being written down. No libraries, no scrolls, just human memory and cultural transmission maintaining geographical precision across hundreds of generations. What else is encoded in oral traditions we've dismissed as mythology? What other accurate information survives in stories that Western academia assumed were fantasy? Indigenous cultures worldwide maintain pharmacological knowledge that was never written in ancient libraries, but has been passed healer to healer for millennia. Modern pharmaceutical companies actively study these traditions, discovering compounds that work exactly as traditional healers claimed. Knowledge that survived specifically because it remained oral and practice-based. When libraries burned, this knowledge continued undisturbed because it had never depended on written texts. Traditional practices preserve ancient knowledge in living form. Yoga predates written records, yet the practices encode sophisticated understanding of the body and consciousness. Tai Chi transmits principles of movement and energy that were never primarily textual. Meditation techniques pass teacher to student, maintain knowledge about altered states and human awareness that survived independently of any library. We're only now scientifically verifying what practitioners have known through direct transmission for millennia. Brain scans confirming what meditators documented through experience. Biomechanical analysis, validating movement principles that traditional teachers preserved through apprenticeship. The knowledge was never lost because it lived in practice, rather than text. Sacred architecture follows similar patterns. Traditional builders in various cultures use geometric principles and construction techniques passed through apprenticeship, not books. When researchers study ancient structures and can't figure out how they were built, they sometimes consult traditional builders who still practice old methods. The knowledge never died because it lived in hands and eyes, an embodied skill rather than written instruction. This is what we might call embodied knowledge. Understanding that exists in practice, ritual, craft, and tradition, rather than text. Knowledge that couldn't be destroyed by burning libraries because it was never in libraries to begin with. It lived in bodies, in communities, in continuous practice. Maybe the most important ancient knowledge was deliberately kept oral for exactly this reason, to protect it from being lost in a single catastrophic burning. The mystery schools famously forbade writing down their core teachings. Was this paranoia, or sophisticated understanding that some knowledge survives better through protected transmission than through vulnerable texts? If we want to understand what ancient civilizations knew, we shouldn't just excavate ruins and read fragments. We should listen to cultures that never fully broke their connection to ancient practices, to indigenous traditions that maintained oral transmission across millennia, to living lineages that preserved knowledge through practice rather than writing. Because when the libraries burned, some knowledge survived in places the fires couldn't reach. In memory, in practice, in traditions that valued living transmission over written record. And that knowledge is still here, waiting for us to recognize its value. So we have archaeology recovering texts, technology reading the unreadable, and traditional knowledge that was never written. All of these give us glimpses of what was lost. But there are also people working right now, today, to preserve knowledge against the same threats that destroyed the ancient libraries. Modern equivalents of the scribes who buried texts in jars before the purges came. The Internet Archive stores 735 billion web pages, 41 million books, and millions of videos, all free, all preserved for humanity. The philosophy is simple and radical. If knowledge exists in millions of copies distributed across the globe, it can't be destroyed. No single fire can burn it. No single authority can eliminate it. Distributed preservation against centralized control. And right now, publishers are suing to destroy it. Same threat, different millennium. Those who profit from controlling knowledge, trying to eliminate those who believe knowledge should be free. The Internet Archive faces legal battles that could shut it down entirely, eliminate decades of preservation work, delete the distributed backup of human knowledge that took years to build. The pattern holds. When knowledge threatens power or profit, power and profit seek to destroy knowledge. WikiLeaks followed similar principles. Distributed servers, encrypted communication, publishing information that governments wanted suppressed. And Julian Assange sits in prison, the modern equivalent of scholars buried alive for refusing to burn books. The mechanisms change: legal prosecution instead of execution, copyright law instead of religious decree, but the underlying dynamic remains identical. Knowledge that threatens institutional control gets targeted for elimination, and those who preserve it face consequences. Then there are the academic rebels, researchers who risk professional reputation to investigate topics that mainstream institutions avoid or actively suppress. Graham Hancock, exploring lost civilizations. Robert Schoch, using geological evidence to question conventional dating of ancient monuments. Scientists studying consciousness and psychedelics, despite the professional stigma. Whether their conclusions are correct matters less than what they represent. The continuation of the tradition of seeking knowledge that establishment academia won't touch. Private collectors present more ambiguous cases. Wealthy individuals and organizations quietly acquiring ancient manuscripts, artifacts, esoteric texts. Are they preserving knowledge or hoarding it? Modern-day monks protecting what's valuable, or gatekeepers controlling access. Some genuinely preserve materials that would otherwise be lost or destroyed. Others accumulate knowledge as power, keeping it restricted, maintaining the same dynamic that ancient authorities practiced. Preservation and control aren't always distinguishable. Esoteric orders claim continuous lineage from ancient traditions. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, various mystery schools asserting they've preserved secret knowledge through initiation rather than publication. Skeptics dismiss them as elaborate role-playing, modern inventions with no genuine connection to antiquity. Believers insist they're the real keepers of what burned, maintaining oral transmission of teachings too dangerous or too sacred to write down. The truth likely falls somewhere between some legitimate preservation mixed with later invention and elaboration. Then there's the open-source knowledge movement. People deliberately placing ancient texts, traditional knowledge, practical techniques into the public domain, specifically to prevent them being lost or controlled. Digitizing rare manuscripts and posting them freely online, translating obscure works and distributing them without copyright, recording traditional practices and making the documentation freely available. The philosophy mirrors the Internet Archive. Make knowledge so widely distributed that it becomes indestructible. We're living in a unique moment. For the first time in human history, knowledge can be copied infinitely and distributed globally at essentially zero cost. The technology exists to make information genuinely indestructible through distributed redundancy. We have the first real chance in history to ensure that what happened to Alexandria, Baghdad, Nalanda can never happen again. But digital knowledge can be erased just as easily as paper burned. Copyright enforcement can delete archives. Legal action can shut down preservation projects. Centralized platforms can be controlled or destroyed. The same battle the ancient librarians fought is happening now, in digital form, with the same stakes. The question becomes personal. What are you going to do about it? Because we've traced the entire arc now. From the greatest libraries ever built, through their systematic destruction, to the fragments that survived, and the knowledge still being recovered. What does all of this mean? What should we do with this understanding? To answer that, we need to see the pattern clearly, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every time power changes hands, new empire, new religion, new ideology, one of the first acts is burning the previous civilization's libraries. Every single time. Alexandria burned when Christianity consolidated power. Pergamum's collection was moved to Alexandria right before the fires. Baghdad fell when the Mongols conquered. China's libraries burned when Qin Shi Huang unified the empire. Nalanda was destroyed when invaders conquered. The Maya codices burned when Spain imposed Christianity. Byzantine libraries scattered when Crusaders sacked Constantinople. This isn't coincidence. It's not ignorance. It's not collateral damage. It's strategy. Because if you control what people know about the past, you control what they can imagine for the future. Destroy the evidence that things were once different, and your current order appears inevitable. Eliminate alternative histories, and your narrative becomes the only narrative. Burn the philosophical works that offered competing worldviews, and your ideology faces no intellectual opposition. The pattern holds across continents and centuries. Nearly every major library destruction occurred during power transitions. Moments when new authorities were consolidating control and couldn't afford competition from alternative knowledge systems. The timing is too consistent to be accidental. And the types of knowledge targeted follow patterns too. Alternative cosmologies and histories that contradict the new power's narrative always burn first. Can't have Egyptian records claiming civilization is tens of thousands of years old when your religion says the world is only a few thousand years old. Can't preserve Babylonian pre-flood histories when you're establishing a single flood narrative. Can't allow Greek heliocentric models when your church insists Earth is the center of creation. Technologies that could decentralize power or be weaponized get eliminated next. Greek fire's formula dies with the Byzantine Empire. Damascus steel techniques burn with Baghdad. Roman engineering secrets scatter and fragment. Any technology that might shift the balance of power, that might make defense impossible or conquest too easy, becomes a target for destruction or suppression. Philosophical and spiritual systems, offering paths to understanding outside institutional control, those get hunted down with particular intensity. The mystery school's teachings destroyed. Gnostic texts burned as heresy. Buddhist sutras eliminated. Alchemical works suppressed. Any knowledge suggesting individuals could access transcendent understanding without priests, without intermediaries, without institutional permission, all of it targeted for elimination. And finally, knowledge that empowers individuals or communities, independent of centralized authority. Medical texts, giving people control over their bodies. Agricultural techniques enabling self-sufficiency. Consciousness practices allowing direct exploration of reality. All of it dangerous, all of it threatening, all of it burned. Was there coordination across these burnings? Probably not direct conspiracy, but perhaps something more disturbing: convergent strategy. Powers throughout history, independently recognizing that knowledge control is the ultimate form of control, arriving at the same solution without needing to communicate. Because the logic is inescapable once you understand it. Controlling information means controlling reality itself. Consider the counterfactual. What if even one major library had survived intact? If Alexandria's full collection existed today, 700,000 scrolls containing the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world, would our civilization be different? Would we have advanced faster technologically? Would certain institutions have less power because alternative models and competing narratives would be readily available? Would we ask different questions, pursue different goals, organize society along different lines? We'll never know. Because the library's burned. And here's the deepest insight, the one that should disturb you most. The burnings weren't just about destroying what was. They were about limiting what could be. By eliminating alternative possibilities, by erasing evidence that things were once different, the destroyers narrowed the range of imaginable futures. This is control at its most profound level, not just ruling people's present circumstances, not just dictating current behavior, but constraining their ability to imagine alternatives, making the current order seem natural, inevitable, the only way things could possibly be. Because if you don't know things were ever different, how can you imagine them being different again? That's what the library burnings accomplished. They didn't just destroy knowledge, they destroyed possibility itself. But here's what they couldn't destroy: the human drive to know, to question, to seek truth even when it's dangerous. And that brings us to why this matters for you, right now, listening to this. You might think a documentary about ancient library burnings is just historical curiosity. Interesting but distant. Tragic but irrelevant to your life in 2025. Except it's not. Because the same battle is happening right now. Different weapons, same war. Algorithms determine what you see online, curating your reality based on what keeps you engaged, rather than what's true or important. Fact-checkers decide what's accurate and what gets labeled misinformation. Platforms deplatform voices that challenge certain narratives. Governments classify information they don't want you to access. Corporations patent traditional knowledge that indigenous cultures preserved for millennia, then restrict access to it. Different mechanisms than burning scrolls, same goal, controlling what people can know. If you've ever felt that truth is being hidden from you, that official narratives don't tell the whole story, that important knowledge is deliberately obscured, you're not paranoid. History proves that powers consistently suppress knowledge, threatening their authority. This happened to ancient libraries. Variations continue today. The pattern didn't end. It evolved. But here's the empowering part. You live in an unprecedented moment. For the first time in human history, knowledge can be infinitely copied and globally distributed at essentially zero cost. The internet, despite all its problems, makes total knowledge destruction nearly impossible. You have access to more information than any human in history. More than scholars in Alexandria who spent their entire lives in that library. More than monks in medieval monasteries who dedicated themselves to preserving texts. More than anyone until about 20 years ago. Think about that. The ancient librarians who buried texts in jars, who hid scrolls in caves, who risked their lives to preserve knowledge against the purges they were protecting it for you. For this moment, when technology would allow anyone with curiosity to access what they fought to save. Don't waste that gift. Don't let algorithms feed you only what keeps you clicking. Don't accept the first explanation you're given. Don't trust that what's easily accessible is all that exists. Actively seek diverse sources. Read primary documents when you can. Explore alternative perspectives. Question official narratives not because they're automatically wrong, but because questioning is how truth gets tested. Build your own library. Physical books that can't be deleted with a server shutdown. Downloaded files stored locally, not dependent on platforms that might disappear or restrict access. Printed documents for things you consider important. Because digital knowledge can be erased just as easily as papyrus burns. The mechanisms differ. The vulnerability remains. The ancient world couldn't save their libraries from fire and conquest. But you can save knowledge from deletion and suppression. You have tools they would have considered miraculous. The ability to copy and preserve and distribute information across the entire planet instantly. Use those tools. Because the greatest tragedy wouldn't be what was lost in the ancient burnings. The greatest tragedy would be having access to more knowledge than ever before and choosing ignorance. Having the tools to resist information, control, and not using them. Having the gift the ancient librarians died trying to preserve and wasting it on passive consumption of whatever algorithms decide to show you. You're watching this documentary because you have questions. because you seek, because something in you refuses to accept that what you've been told is all there is to know. That instinct, that drive, that curiosity, that's what connects you to the ancient knowledge keepers. That's what they were trying to preserve. Not just the specific texts, but the impulse itself, the refusal to stop asking questions. They succeeded. You're proof of that. The fire didn't destroy human curiosity. It didn't eliminate the drive to know. 2,000 years later, you're here, seeking, questioning, refusing to accept easy answers. So honor that. Don't let it be passive entertainment. Let it be the beginning of something. So that's why it matters personally. But there's a bigger question, a final question, that we have to address. After everything we've explored, all the loss, all the patterns, all the implications, there's one thing left to ask. What do we do now? We've spent hours exploring one of history's greatest tragedies, the systematic destruction of human knowledge across continents and centuries. It's overwhelming, tragic, sometimes infuriating. You might be feeling the weight of everything that was lost, everything we'll never recover, everything that could have been different if just one major library had survived intact. But here's the thing. We're not helpless. We're not just passive observers mourning what's gone. We have choices. 3 paths forward, and you can walk all of them simultaneously. First, preservation. Support the people and organizations doing what those ancient scribes did when they buried texts in jars. The Internet Archive needs funding to fight legal battles and maintain servers. Archaeological projects, recovering ancient texts, need support. Buy physical books. Download and store files locally. Make backup copies of knowledge you consider important. Become a modern keeper of what matters. The technology exists to make knowledge indestructible through distribution, but only if people actually use it. Second, exploration. Be the seeker. Study what survived. Learn from traditional knowledge keepers who maintained wisdom outside written form. Explore ideas that mainstream institutions ignore or suppress. The ancient knowledge isn't completely lost. Fragments exist everywhere if you know where to look. Read primary sources when you can. Learn dead languages if you're dedicated enough. Travel to places where old practices survive. Most importantly, think for yourself. Question everything, including what you're hearing right now. That's not rebellion. That's honoring the tradition of inquiry that the library burnings tried to eliminate. Third, creation. Add to human knowledge. Every insight you have, every technique you develop, every truth you discover, record it, share it, distribute it widely enough that it can't be lost. We live in the first era where an ordinary person can publish globally. Use that. Be the scribe who preserves for future generations. Maybe what you preserve seems small or personal or unimportant. The ancient librarians didn't discriminate. They collected everything, because they understood that you never know what future generations will find valuable. But here's the deepest truth, the one that reframes everything we've discussed. The library burnings were supposed to end inquiry. They were supposed to eliminate dangerous questions. They were supposed to narrow what humans could imagine, could know, could become. They were supposed to control the future by controlling access to the past. They failed. You are proof they failed. You're here, right now, at the end of this journey, because you have questions, because you seek knowledge, because you refuse to accept that what you've been told is all there is to know. That drive, that curiosity, that refusal to stop asking, that's what they tried to burn. The texts were just paper and ink. What they really wanted to destroy was the impulse to question, the drive to know. It didn't work. The Library of Alexandria burned 2,000 years ago. Baghdad's House of Wisdom was thrown into the Tigris. Nalanda burned for 3 months. The Maya codices turned to ash in front of the people whose history they contained. But the fire didn't win, because the desire to know, to understand, to preserve, to question that survived. Through every purge, every burning, every systematic attempt to control what humans could know. You're the proof. The ancient librarians would be proud. They saved what they could. They hid what they had to. And they hoped that someday, someone like you would seek it out. Don't stop seeking. Don't stop questioning. And don't let the fire win. We started this journey standing in ruins, wondering what was lost, asking why it happened. Now you know. The library's burned. But the fire didn't win. Every time you ask a question that makes someone uncomfortable, you're honoring those who died protecting knowledge. Every time you seek what you're not supposed to seek, you're proving that 2,000 years of burning couldn't destroy the human drive to know. The ancient librarians hid texts in jars and sealed them in cliffs, hoping someone would find them. You did. Not the physical scrolls, those are still being discovered, but something more important. The understanding that knowledge has always been a battleground, that truth has always been dangerous, that seeking has always required courage. They couldn't destroy the question. They couldn't burn curiosity itself. And now, you carry it forward. The libraries fell. But you're still here, still asking, still seeking. That's how the fire loses. These bookends frame the journey from mystery to empowerment, creating a narrative arc that transforms viewers from passive observers into active participants in preserving and seeking knowledge.